She walked through the gate of Blackridge Forward Station with no rank on her collar, no unit patch on her shoulder, and no weapon on her hip. The Marine at the checkpoint looked her over once, looked again, then actually laughed. Inside the operations room, 32 of America's most elite operators turned to stare at the woman who had just walked into their pre-mission brief. A SEAL commander the size of a refrigerator stepped directly into her path. She didn't stop walking. Within 6 hours, every man in that room would owe her his life. Within 12, they would be standing at attention on a tarmac in the dark, saluting her. If you've been waiting for a story that hits differently, this is it. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this one starts fast and doesn't slow down. The helicopter banked hard over the last ridgeline before Blackridge, and Evelyn Carter pressed her shoulder against the cold aluminum hull and looked down at what would be her home for the next 36 hours. It wasn't much to look at. Blackridge Forward Station occupied a narrow shelf of flat ground carved into the base of a limestone massif, the kind of terrain feature that military planners selected not for comfort, but because it was defensible from 3 sides, and the 4th side dropped into a river gorge that nothing motorized could cross. Perimeter walls of stacked HESCO barriers and sandbag revetments. 4 watchtowers at each corner, each one manned and lit with the red-filtered glow of personnel who understood light discipline. A cluster of modular prefab buildings connected by plywood walkways that would turn to ankle-deep mud the moment rain hit this valley. Antenna arrays on every elevated surface. Comms, sensor packages, things she couldn't identify at altitude but recognized by shape. 2 helicopter pads on the eastern edge, both occupied by birds that looked like they had been patched and repatched, past the point where a maintenance officer stateside would have grounded them. Out here, grounded wasn't always an option. The mountains surrounding the station were the dominant fact of everything. Jagged limestone faces that caught no afternoon light, only shadow, rising on 3 sides and walls that felt close enough to touch from altitude. The kind of terrain that killed people, not usually through firefights, but through falls, cold, exhaustion, and the particular brutality of radio signals dying in the narrow draws between ridges where you needed them most. She had operated in worse. The pilot's voice came through the headset with the flat effect of someone who had made this approach enough times to find it boring. 2 minutes. Evelyn checked her pack one final time. Light. 1 change of field clothing, water, nutrition, optics, a medical kit she hoped not to need, and the documentation that would get her through the gate. No weapon. She would draw that from the armory on site. No rank insignia, no unit patch, no branch identifier of any kind. The only thing that set her apart from a civilian contractor was a laminated identification card in her left breast pocket, and that card was so heavily classified that the clearance level printed on it required additional authorization to even read. 41 people in the Department of Defense had that authorization. She had confirmed the number 2 weeks ago. The helicopter shuddered down onto the pad with the graceless thump of a machine that had been pushed hard. Evelyn stepped off before the rotors had fully settled, pack over one shoulder, face into the rotor wash, and walked toward the gate without waiting to be escorted. The Marine at the checkpoint was maybe 22. Alert, squared away, doing his job correctly, which meant he had his hand out for credentials before she was fully through the funnel. Good instincts. She respected that. She gave him the card. He looked at it. Something changed in his face. A small, almost invisible tightening around the eyes that happened when the clearance level registered against whatever he'd been trained to recognize. Then he looked up at her. Took her in. The unmarked clothing, the single pack, the absence of weapons, the complete absence of anything that visually communicated authority. "Ma'am," he paused. "What unit are you assigned to?" "I'm not assigned to a unit. I'm assigned to the operation." He looked at the card again, looked at her again. His training told him the clearance was real and processed. His instincts, built from 18 months on a base where everyone who mattered wore rank insignia and walked like they owned the ground under them, were telling him something about this situation didn't line up the way situations were supposed to line up. "One moment, ma'am." He keyed his radio, called it in. She waited without fidgeting, without checking her watch, without doing any of the things people did when they were performing patience rather than actually possessing it. Overhead, a hawk worked the narrow band of sky between the ridge lines, riding thermals that didn't look strong enough to support anything heavier than a paper glider. The radio crackled. She caught fragments. Her name, a confirmation code, a short response that made the Marine's posture shift in a way that was almost too small to notice. Almost. He handed the card back. "You're clear to enter, ma'am." A fractional pause. "Operations building is the third structure on your left. Master Sergeant Holt will meet you." "Thank you." She walked through the gate into Blackridge Forward Station and didn't look back. Master Sergeant Dale Holt was 51 years old and looked like a man who had spent 3 decades making other people's bad plans work through sheer refusal to accept failure as a category. Lean, weathered, with hands that had the permanent roughness of someone who had spent more time in the field than behind a desk. He was waiting outside the operations building with a ceramic mug of coffee and an expression that communicated absolutely nothing useful. "Ms. Carter." "Sergeant Holt." "You want coffee?" "Fair warning, we have 2 varieties. One's terrible. The other is technically worse." "Either." He handed her his own mug without ceremony, turned, and walked inside. She followed. The operations building was larger than it looked from the exterior. A long central room with map tables running the length of it, screens on 3 walls cycling through satellite imagery, grid overlays, and real-time sensor feeds. A controlled chaos energy filled the space, the specific hum of a room where a dozen people were simultaneously doing things that needed to be done correctly and understood that they had limited time to do them. It smelled like stale coffee and gun oil, and the particular kind of compressed stress that settles into a workspace when a mission window is 12 hours away. The men in the room registered her arrival the way men in rooms like this always did, with a surveillance that was practiced enough to look casual but wasn't. She was assessed in roughly 4 seconds by everyone present. Height, build, age, bearing, gear, the absence of visible weapons, the absence of rank. She had been assessed like that her entire professional life. She knew exactly what was happening behind those eyes. She was used to it. What she had learned to do with it was something different. "Captain Webb runs the assault element," Holt said quietly as they moved through the room. "Commander Morrison has tactical command of the operation. You'll meet them both in the brief." "I know Morrison's name." Holt glanced at her sideways, said nothing. A voice cut across the room from the far end of the map table. Not loud, just precisely calibrated to carry. "Overwatch Specialist." Captain Marcus Webb, Marsa E, said those 2 words with the particular inflection of someone who was technically observing a fact, but was actually doing something else entirely. He was maybe 35, built like someone who had been running and lifting every morning for 15 years and had no intention of stopping, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of jaw that communicated stubbornness even at rest. He was looking at her the way people look at something that has arrived in the wrong packaging. The thing itself might be fine, but the packaging raises questions about whether anyone thought this through. "That's the assignment," Evelyn said. "Where have you operated previously?" "Classified." "What unit?" "Classified." "Branch of service?" "Classified." Webb held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at Holt with an expression that asked, without words, "Is this a joke?" Holt studied his coffee mug. Several men in the room had stopped pretending to work. 3 seats down from Webb, a ranger with a name tape that read, Coletti leaned slightly toward the operator beside him and said something at a volume he probably thought was below her threshold. It wasn't. 1-800 meters, in these mountains. With a stranger on Overwatch we know nothing about. Someone's going to explain to me how this is the plan. Evelyn looked at the map on the table, said nothing. "Brief starts in 40 minutes, Webb said. "You're welcome to sit in and get oriented." Welcome to sit in, like she was an observer, like this was a field trip. "I'm not sitting in," she said. "I'm part of the brief." Something moved across Webb's face, too fast and too controlled to read cleanly. He turned back to his map without responding. The briefing room was adjacent to the main ops center, smaller and packed. When Evelyn walked in, 37 minutes later, she ran a quick count from the doorway. 6 Army Rangers, 8 Navy SEALs, 4 Recon Marines, 2 intelligence officers, a signals specialist, and 3 others she couldn't immediately categorize. Operators who wore their experience in the way they occupied space, like people accustomed to not needing to announce themselves. 30 total, plus her. Commander Jake Morrison stood at the front of the room. He was not the tallest man present, but he was the one the room organized itself around without anyone appearing to consciously do it. Compact, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked like it had absorbed a few decisions it hadn't agreed with and kept functioning anyway. The kind of presence that didn't require volume to fill a space. He ran the brief with precise, economical efficiency. No filler words, no performative emphasis, every sentence doing a specific job. Target is Commander Rashid Kamal. The screen behind him showed a photograph. A heavy-set man in his mid-50s with a beard gone mostly gray and eyes that photographed flat. Kamal coordinates logistics for at least 3 active networks operating across this province. He's been on the target list for 14 months. Tonight we close that account. The screen shifted to overhead imagery. A walled compound set into the upper slope of a valley. Irregular footprint, construction that suggested multiple phases over multiple years. Intel confirms 2 American civilian contractors are being held in the lower structures here and here. Our objectives are extraction of both contractors and permanent neutralization of Kamal, in that order. He walked the room through the assault plan with the same spare efficiency. 2 insertion teams by helicopter using offset flight paths to approach from angles that avoided the compound's elevated sightlines. Breach point on the eastern wall, which thermal imaging indicated was least monitored. Primary assault element, Morrison leading, driving toward the main structure where Kamal was expected to be. Secondary element covering the lower buildings where the hostages were held. Overwatch position here. He tapped a point on the topographic map. A ridgeline 1,780 meters northeast of the compound, elevated enough to command the compound rooftop, the vehicle approach road, and 3 of the 4 viable exit routes from the valley floor. Long-range coverage of the vehicle road is the priority tasking. Intel has a Kamal reinforcement element positioned 14 kilometers to the north, approximately 40 personnel, 3 vehicles. If that element moves during the operation, we need them stopped at the natural choke point here. He indicated a switchback section of the mountain road. Before they reach the valley entrance, we cannot have them arriving while the assault element is still inside the compound. He stepped back from the map. Questions. Webb raised a hand. Who's on Overwatch? Morrison looked toward the end of the table where Evelyn sat. Ms. Carter. The room's ambient noise dropped. Not dramatically. Professionals didn't do dramatic. But the particular hum of background activity and minor crosstalk that filled a briefing room simply reduced, the way a room goes quieter when everyone in it decides to pay attention to the same thing at the same time. Evelyn was aware of 30 pairs of eyes. She looked at the map. The vehicle road, she said. Everyone continued looking at her. She kept her eyes on the topographic overlay. The choke point you've indicated, between the first and second switchback. What's the elevation differential between the road surface and the ridgeline on the eastern side at that grid reference? Morrison looked at his intelligence officer, Specialist Rao, 26, sharp, the kind of analyst who had the data pre-pulled because she anticipated the questions. Rao checked her tablet. Approximately 34 meters. And the prevailing wind direction at ridge altitude during the mission window? Rao cross-referenced. Northwest. Estimated 12 to 18 knots at ridge height, based on the morning sonde data and forecast modeling. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, looking at the terrain contours. Your indicated choke point is the obvious choice. The road narrows, the shoulders are too soft for vehicle bypass, and the curve limits line of sight for the following vehicle. But the angle from my overwatch position to that section creates a firing solution with a significant left-to-right crosswind component at range, especially at the upper end of that wind estimate. The more effective stop point is 40 meters further south, just before the road cuts back on itself at the second switchback. At that point, the angle to the ridgeline improves, and the crosswind component to my firing solution reduces by approximately 30%. A disabled vehicle at that location also creates a harder block. The road bank on the downhill side is steeper, and there's no room to push a disabled vehicle off the edge to clear passage. She looked up from the map for the first time. Your timing calculation should account for 11 additional seconds for the vehicles to reach that position from the original reference point. The briefing room was quiet. Morrison looked at Rao. Rao was already working her tablet, pulling the ballistic geometry overlay, cross-referencing the terrain model. 15 seconds passed. 20. She's right. Rao said. She said it quietly, the way people say things when they're reporting a fact they've just confirmed, and the fact is more significant than they expected. The angle improvement is real. I missed the crosswind geometry at that section of road. Morrison looked at Evelyn for a moment. His face didn't change, not visibly, but something in the quality of his attention shifted in a way that was different from before. Webb had not shifted at all. His expression was sealed and professional and told her nothing she didn't already expect. The brief continued. She asked 2 more questions, both of them technical, both of them answered correctly by Rao on reference. Morrison integrated her input into the timing calculations without fanfare. When the brief ended and the room began to move, 3 operators who had been watching her through the whole thing did so more carefully on the way out than they had on the way in. After the brief, equipment issue. Evelyn requested armory access to select a rifle for the operation. That request was processed through the proper channels. What happened at the range an hour later was not processed through any channel at all. It was simply what happened. 14 operators ended up there. She would never know exactly whose idea it was or how the word spread, but it spread the way things spread in tight operational environments, which was instantly and without anyone taking visible credit. The afternoon sun was already dropping behind the western ridgeline, pulling the temperature down with a speed that reminded her this was mountain country regardless of what the calendar said. The range was a functional field setup, painted distance stakes, paper targets at intervals from 100 to 1,400 meters, a spotting scope on a sandbag rest, and 2 men already at that scope when she arrived. Sergeant First Class Briggs had organized it. She knew this immediately, and not because anyone told her. She knew it from the way he was standing when she walked up, with the studied casualness of a man who had arranged the situation and was now pretending he hadn't. Thick-necked, broad, with the flat confidence of a professional who had been very good at his job for a long time and had learned to trust that judgment about most things. He smiled when he saw her, not warmly, the kind of smile that meant, "Let's find out." "Figured you'd want to zero the rifle before tomorrow," he said. "Get some trigger time with the mountain conditions. Wind out here's different than most places people train." She looked at the rifle he was holding out toward her. 338 Lapua Magnum, bolt action, chassis stock, first focal plane scope with a reticle pattern she didn't recognize by the hash marks. She took it. "What's the load?" she asked. 285 grain Hornady, lot from 3 months ago. She looked at the scope, checked the diopter, worked the bolt 3 times, feeling the throw, the cam angle, the extraction force, checked the trigger with her finger outside the guard, felt the weight, the wall, the break point. She tilted the rifle and looked at the stock geometry, pressed it to her cheek, adjusted her head position slightly. 90 seconds, maybe 100. "What magnification does the primary user run?" 25, Briggs said. "That's where Kowalski keeps it." "Who's Kowalski?" "Best shooter on the team." She turned the magnification ring down 3 clicks to 18. Nobody said anything. A couple of glances exchanged. She ignored them. She settled behind the rifle on the sandbag rest, adjusted her position once, a small shift of her left elbow, a change in the angle of her neck, and then went still. Not the rigid stillness of someone concentrating hard. The other kind. The kind that good shooters find when everything unnecessary has been put down. She fired at the 300-meter target. Center. Cycled the bolt. Fired again without pausing to check the first impact. At the spotting scope, a ranger named Torres pressed his eye to the glass and said nothing for a moment. "Same hole," he said finally. He said it the way you say something when the fact is doing the work and commentary would only diminish it. She moved to 600. 3 shots. The group was tight enough that it required the scope to distinguish 3 individual impacts from one. At 1,000 meters, the wind had shifted. A genuine crosswind now, gusting irregular, lifting dust and dead grass from the range surface in patterns that changed direction every few seconds. Most shooters would have paused here, read the flags, checked their charts, built their solution through the visible process of calculation. She fired after 6 seconds of stillness. Hit, fired again, hit. "She's not ranging it," Coletti said. He wasn't being dismissive. He was just saying what he was observing, the way you state an observable fact that requires explanation. "She's reading the wind off the surface texture." The SEAL named Kessler said it quietly, from 2 positions down. He'd shot competitively for 4 years before recruiting into the teams, and he was watching her with the specific attention of someone watching a skill set that exceeded his own reference points. Look at her eyes. When the wind shifts, she's not looking at the target, she's looking at the ground between her and it. Nobody responded to that. At 400 meters, the target was a half silhouette, small at that range, through any optic. The crosswind was still variable. The light was going fast now, bleeding out of the sky in the way mountain light did. Sudden, total, like someone had made a decision about it. Briggs moved to the spotting scope without being asked. He positioned himself carefully, pressed his eye to the glass, and waited. Evelyn spent 45 seconds on this one, completely still. The rifle barely moved with her breathing, a slow, almost invisible rise and fall that told anyone watching she had control of her respiratory cycle in a way that most shooters described but few actually achieved. The rifle fired. Briggs pressed his eye to the scope, said nothing. 1 second. 2. High edge, he said. 2 inches, maybe a little more. She cycled the bolt. Her right hand moved to the elevation dial on the scope, a small, precise adjustment, a fraction of a revolution. Only she knew the number she'd calculated. She fired. 3 seconds of silence. Center, Briggs said. She fired 4 more rounds. Each one landed within a 3-inch circle of the target's center at 400 meters, in crosswind, in failing light, with a rifle she had been holding for 11 minutes. She cleared the weapon, stood up, handed the rifle back to Briggs with the bolt locked open. "I'll want this one for the operation," she said. Briggs took it. He was looking at her the way people look at things after the facts have revised their understanding of what they were looking at. Not warm, not apologetic, just recalibrated. Direct. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." Around her, the range was quiet. 14 operators standing in the gathering cold, and not one of them was doing anything that could be described as smiling. Coletti was looking at the distant target through his own optic. He lowered it after a moment and looked at the ground for a few seconds, processing something. Nobody laughed on the walk back to the station. Well, they assigned her a room at the eastern end of the accommodation block. 4 plywood walls, a cot, a single overhead bulb on a cord that swung when the generator cycled. No window. The wall against the mountain was cold to the touch, even through the insulation. And the sounds that came through it were the sounds of stone settling in the night cold. She ate a meal bar, drank water from her bottle, pulled the topographic map from her pack and spread it on the cot, running a red-filtered headlamp across the terrain features between her intended overwatch position and the target compound until she could close her eyes and navigate it mentally without error. Every contour, every approach angle, every dead ground fold that could conceal movement from her position. At 2100, a knock on the door. "Come in." Morrison opened it. He stood in the frame rather than entering, filling most of the doorway, arms crossed, his eyes moving across the room in a single, efficient scan. The disassembled rifle components on the cot, the map, the blank walls, the absence of anything personal. "Most people bring something for the downtime," he said. "Laptop, books. I don't need that for this." A pause. He was deciding something. "Run the full ballistics model on your firing position adjustment after the brief. The wind component reduction at the alternate stop point. She confirmed it. You were right on both counts." "I know." Another pause, longer this time. "Where did you train?" "I can't discuss that." "Is there anything in your record that's actually discussable?" She looked at him directly. "I can tell you I've held an overwatch position in terrain similar to this. Different mountains, same physics. That I understand what it means to watch a team. I'm responsible for moving through a structure in the dark and know that if my solution is wrong, the consequences aren't theoretical." A beat. "I can tell you I don't miss." Morrison was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the words were deliberate. "Some of my people are uncomfortable with this arrangement. I know. Webb specifically. He won't cause a problem operationally, but he doesn't trust you." "He doesn't need to trust me," Evelyn said. "He needs to execute his assault plan and let me execute mine. Those aren't the same requirement." Morrison studied her for another moment. Something in his expression had moved. Not far, not dramatically, just enough to indicate the calibration was ongoing and the data he was working with had changed since that morning. Insertion is at 0200, he said. Be staged by 0130. I'll be there at 0155. He nodded once, pulled the door closed. She sat in the silence for a long moment after he left, listening to the generators and the distant creak of the watchtower structure moving in the wind, and thought about the road. The reinforcement element, 14 kilometers north. 40 personnel. 3 vehicles. Sitting there right now in the dark, not knowing yet that the night had been planned around them. The problem with long-range overwatch was that it looked from the outside like patience. People who didn't understand the job thought the waiting was passive, thought it was the easy part, just sitting still, watching, pulling a trigger when the moment came. The waiting was never the easy part. The waiting was when the full weight of it settled on you, unmediated by activity or preparation or the forward momentum of a plan in execution. The waiting was when you understood, at absolute depth, that every decision you made alone in the dark, the fraction of a degree, the half-second of timing, the wind call you calculated with no one to confirm it, would determine whether the people you were covering came home or didn't, and no one would see you make those decisions. No one would be there to validate them. Just the scope, the wind, the trigger, and the complete solitude of the person behind the rifle. That was the job. Not the marksmanship, the weight of it. She had carried that weight for 9 years. It had never become lighter. She had simply become stronger. She field-stripped the rifle in the dark without the lamp, reassembled it by touch, set it against the wall, lay down on the cot without undressing, and stared at the swinging bulb until someone switched off the generator and the room went completely dark. She was in the staging area at 0108, 22 minutes early. The room was not empty. 2 Rangers were already running gear checks at the far end, and a signals specialist was testing radio connections at a bench near the door. Briggs arrived 4 minutes after her, registered her presence with a glance, and moved to the equipment rack without commentary. She read that as something. Coletti came in at 01199, stopped when he saw her already kitted, chest rig seated correctly, pack riding right, rifle slung, and stood for a moment. For what it's worth, he said, what you did on the range today, that's something. I know, she said. He made a sound that might have become a laugh under different circumstances. Then he moved to his rack. The room filled methodically, gear checks, radio checks, the quiet that settles over professionals in the hour before they do the thing they've trained to do. Not silence exactly, but a reduction. The adrenaline burned off years ago in men like these. What replaced it was something more functional and colder, a focused, deliberate readiness that didn't require noise to sustain itself. Morrison arrived at 0123. He walked the room once, not inspecting, just present, the way a team leader moves through a staged element to communicate without words that he has accounted for everything and found it acceptable. He paused at her position for half a second. Set? Set. He moved on. Webb was at the far end of the room, running a final check on his kit with the efficiency of someone who had checked it 3 times already and was checking it again because that was the standard, not because he doubted the previous checks. He looked up once, found her across the room. His face gave nothing. He looked back at his gear. Professional. That was all she needed from him. At 0130, Morrison called the element to order. A final intel update. No change to the compound layout. Thermal still showing 14 bodies inside. The reinforcement element to the north had not moved. They haven't moved yet, Morrison said, with a specific weight on the last word that the room absorbed without discussion. Wheels up at 0200. Stay locked. Through the open bay door, the helicopters were already turning. She could feel the vibration in the floor under her boots. On the mountains above the station, the wind was moving in a way she could read from the sound it made against the HESCO walls. Shifting, westerly component, strengthening slightly from the conditions she'd observed at the range. She filed that, updated her internal model. Evelyn tightened the last strap on her pack. Checked the rifle once more. Bolt, scope, the elevation dial set at the position she'd left it after her final calculations. She looked through the open bay door at the mountains. Enormous, dark, indifferent to the things that were about to happen in them. 30 people in this room were about to fly into those mountains. 30 people who had spent the last 16 hours assessing her and finding the picture incomplete. The clearance without a record, the name without a unit, the skill without a visible origin. Some of them had revised that picture at the range. Some hadn't. It didn't matter. None of it mattered once the rotors were turning. What mattered was the road, the choke point. The math that she carried alone and would execute alone in the dark, long 780 meters from every other human being on the operation. She picked up the rifle, walked toward the helicopter pads. Behind her, the staging room light clicked off, and the Afghan night came in through the open bay door like water filling a space. Complete, immediate, total. Somewhere ahead in the dark, the mountains were waiting. And somewhere 14 kilometers north of a compound that didn't know it was already an objective, 40 men were sitting in 3 vehicles with their engines cold, not yet knowing that the woman the gate guard had almost laughed at was the only reason they wouldn't reach the valley before dawn. She walked into the dark. The helicopters were already screaming. The helicopters lifted off Black Ridge at 0203, 3 minutes behind schedule, because one of the Rangers had a radio malfunction that took 90 seconds to diagnose and another 90 to fix. Morrison said nothing about the delay. He sat in the forward bird with his eyes closed and his hands loose on his knees, and Evelyn, seated across from him in the red-lit interior, watched him do it and understood that this was not a man who meditated or performed calm. He simply had nothing left to prove to himself about what was coming and had learned to conserve accordingly. She did the same. The flight was 41 minutes through mountain terrain that the pilots navigated at low altitude and high speed, hugging the valley floors to stay below radar coverage that probably wasn't active but might be. The bird shuddered and dropped and climbed through air pockets that felt like hitting potholes at speed. 2 Rangers across from her looked uncomfortable. A SEAL to her left had his eyes open and fixed on the middle distance in the specific way of someone who had made peace with turbulence through extended exposure rather than comfort. She spent the flight running numbers, wind at altitude, extrapolated from the sonda data and the conditions she'd observed at the range, temperature dropping, which meant air density changes that affected bullet trajectory over long distances in ways that most people didn't calculate, and that she had been calculating since she was 23 years old in a program that officially didn't exist and still didn't. The elevation of her overwatch position relative to the target compound, 340 meters above, which created a downward angle that required correction. The road. The vehicles. The choke point 40 meters south of where Morrison's plan had originally indicated. She ran it until it was automatic, until the numbers lived in her hands rather than her head. The helicopter flared and touched down in a shallow draw 4 kilometers from the compound. No lights, no sound beyond the rotors, and those were already winding down. The assault element offloaded in under 90 seconds, and the birds were back in the air before the dust they'd raised had settled. 31 people stood in the dark at the base of a mountain they needed to climb. Morrison's voice came over the command net, low, clipped, each word doing exactly one job. Element Alpha, you have the compound approach. Bravo, lower buildings. Carter, you're moving independently to Overwatch. Radio check at position. Copy, she said into her headset. Good luck? She didn't respond to that. She turned toward the ridgeline and started moving. Her route to the Overwatch position was 2.3 kilometers, mostly vertical, across terrain that had been assessed by satellite imagery, but that satellite imagery never fully captured. The loose shale under the surface rock, the places where the slope angle changed without visual warning, the draws that looked passable from above and became cliff faces from the inside. She moved without a light, navigating by the ambient glow of a partial moon and the topographic map she had committed to memory in her room at Black Ridge. She moved fast. Not recklessly. She tested each footfall before committing weight, stayed below ridgelines, used the vegetation for cover even in the dark. But fast. Because the insertion timeline required her to be in position and confirmed before the assault element reached the compound perimeter, and the assault element was moving. 40 minutes up. Harder than the map suggested because the upper third of the ridge was looser than the imagery implied. Shale that shifted underfoot in ways that required constant micro-adjustments in balance and route. Her left knee, which had been rebuilt twice after 2 separate incidents she couldn't discuss in any official setting, complained on the steepest section. She moved through it. At 0322, she settled into position. The Overwatch point was a natural shelf in the rock face. Not large, barely enough to lie prone and extended, but oriented correctly and with a clear line of sight to the compound below and the road beyond. She spent 4 minutes constructing a position, Small stones moved to stabilize her firing platform. Vegetation adjusted to reduce her profile against the ridge without creating visible disturbance. Her pack positioned to support her left elbow at the correct height and angle. Then she glassed the compound. Through the thermal scope, the compound was alive with heat signatures. She counted 14 bodies, consistent with the intel brief. 3 in the main building, moving with the irregular pattern of people keeping watch. 4 clustered in the lower structure where the hostages were held. Others distributed across the courtyard and along the walls. And 1 on the roof. She keyed her radio. Overwatch to command, in position. 13 confirmed inside, 1 on roof, northeast corner, elevated. Not in the brief. A pause. Then Morrison's voice. Copy, Overwatch. Can you get eyes on the road? She shifted the scope. The vehicle road came into view, switchbacks descending the far valley wall. Empty. Road is clear. 0 vehicles. Copy. Hold position. Alpha is 12 minutes from breach. She settled in. The mountain cold was serious now. Not the uncomfortable cold of a cool evening, the specific penetrating cold of high altitude in the early hours, the kind that found every gap in your clothing and worked its way into the joints. She had trained in worse. She controlled her breathing and let the cold exist without giving it any of her attention. 12 minutes became 15, became 18. Morrison's voice. Alpha is at breach point. 30 seconds. She moved the scope back to the compound roof. The guard in the northeast corner had moved. He was now on the western edge, looking outward, facing almost directly toward her position. He hadn't seen her. At this distance and in this darkness, he couldn't have. But he was facing the wrong direction relative to the assault element's approach, which meant if he stayed there through the breach, he would hear it before they were inside and have a clean sightline to the courtyard. Overwatch to command. Roof guard has repositioned. Western edge, facing your breach direction. He will have eyes on your entry point. A half-second pause. Can you take him before breach? She had already settled the scope's reticle on the figure. Yes. Stand by. A longer pause. 4 seconds. 5. Take him. She exhaled slowly. Let the natural respiratory pause extend. The figure on the roof was 1,810 meters away. She had ranged it precisely when she'd first settled into position. The wind at this altitude was from the northwest at approximately 14 knots, with a slight variation in the lower air column above the compound that she'd been reading from the smoke rising from a generator exhaust near the main building. She fired. The suppressed report was a flat mechanical sound that the mountain absorbed immediately. Below, the figure on the roof dropped. Roof guard down, she said. Copy. Then immediately, Alpha is breaching. Through this scope, the compound's eastern wall, 1,800 meters away and 70 meters below her position, suddenly had people moving over it, fast, low, practiced. The assault element was inside. She shifted to the road. For 11 minutes, the operation ran clean. She monitored the road, empty, and swept the surrounding ridgelines for movement that didn't belong there. Through her earpiece, the assault net was a controlled stream of short, compressed transmissions, call signs, status, movement. Bravo element had the lower building. Alpha was pushing toward the main structure. No resistance yet, which meant either Kamal's people were sleeping or they were waiting. Then, contact, contact, Alpha has contact, main building, second floor. The net went sharp. She heard the distinct compression of suppressed weapons fire even at this distance. A sound that traveled through mountain air differently than it did through any other medium, stripped of bass and arriving flat and hard. 2 down, pushing to third floor. Kamal is still upstairs. She kept her eyes on the road. Bravo has the packages, both contractors, ambulatory, moving to extraction point. Good, that was good. She filed it and kept watching the road. Then a different voice on the net, the signals specialist back at Black Ridge, call sign Echo. Command, this is Echo. I'm picking up radio traffic north of your position, bearing consistent with the reinforcement element. They're on the move. Evelyn's stomach didn't drop. She had trained herself out of that response years ago, but something tightened in her chest. Not fear exactly, more like the physical sensation of a problem becoming real. Echo, say timeline. Unknown, traffic is encrypted. I can't confirm they're moving to your location, but they're active. They were quiet for 6 hours and now they're talking. Morrison came on. Overwatch, get eyes on the northern approach. She was already swinging the scope. The road north of the choke point. She picked it up at the limit of useful vision, 2,600 meters, maybe more. And in this light, the thermal scope was her only tool. She saw them. 3 heat signatures. Vehicles. Large ones, the size of the trucks the intel brief had described. Moving. Already past the first bend in the northern road. Already committed. Command, this is Overwatch. 3 vehicles on the northern approach. I have visual. They are moving, bearing south, approximately 2.4 kilometers from the choke point. Morrison's response came immediately. Copy. How long to your stop point? She calculated. Vehicle speed on this grade. She estimated 40 kilometers per hour, possibly less given the switchbacks. Distance to her preferred stop point, 40 meters south of the original reference. Approximately 7 minutes, maybe 8. Alpha still has 2 minutes in the building. Bravo is 4 minutes from extraction point. She did the math. It was close. Too close for comfort, not impossible. I can stop them at the choke point. I need them moving for another 5 minutes before they're in range. Copy. You have the road. She settled in on the northern approach and watched the vehicles descend. Through the thermal scope, they were 3 bright rectangles moving in convoy formation, close spacing, maybe 30 meters between vehicles, which told her they were disciplined and expected trouble. Disciplined convoy spacing made the second and third vehicles harder to stop because a disabled lead vehicle didn't necessarily block the road if the following vehicles had room to maneuver. She had already accounted for this. Her stop point was the apex of the second switchback's outer curve. At that exact location, the road surface was at its narrowest, 2 meters of packed dirt with a rock face rising vertically on the inside and a drop of approximately 9 meters on the outside. A disabled vehicle there, positioned nose out from the curve, would block both lanes completely. The following vehicles would have no room to push it, no room to go around it, and the grade above the switchback was too steep for any vehicle she'd seen in the intel package to reverse up under fire. 1 shot. The lead vehicle. Timed correctly. She watched them come. The earpiece continued. Alpha has Kamal. He's moving, he's running, 2nd floor window. A burst of compressed transmission noise. Then, Kamal is down, Alpha is clearing and moving. She kept her eyes on the road. The lead vehicle was at the 3rd switchback from her stop point. She tracked it. The convoy was moving faster than she'd estimated, closer to 50 kilometers per hour, which suggested the driver was skilled and confident on this terrain, which suggested these were not men who had been sitting 14 kilometers north doing nothing for the past 3 weeks. They had been waiting, and now someone had told them to move. Overwatch. Alpha is out of the building, moving to extraction. 4 minutes. 4 minutes. The vehicles were 2 minutes from her stop point, maybe a little more. Bravo with the contractors was 4 minutes from the extraction zone. The helicopters were 8 minutes out from the extraction zone. They would have started moving the moment Alpha confirmed Kamal down. The math was tight, very tight. She felt it the way she always felt it at this stage. Not as panic, not as the cold flood of adrenaline that hit people who hadn't been here before, but as a kind of absolute focus that narrowed everything outside the scope and the numbers to a background that simply ceased to matter. Overwatch. Morrison's voice, and for the first time she heard something underneath it. Not fear, but the particular compression of a man who is running calculations and not liking what they produced. Talk to me. Lead vehicle is 90 seconds from my stop point. I'm ready. Copy. What's your confidence level? She almost said hi. Instead, she said, I'll stop them. A pause. Copy. She waited. 60 seconds. 45. The lead vehicle came around the upper switchback and she had her first clean look at it through the scope. A heavy-bodied pickup truck with what appeared to be a reinforced bed, moving fast, the driver handling the switchback with one hand and the familiarity of someone who had driven this road before. 30 seconds. She began her respiratory cycle, the natural pause between exhale and the next breath. The stillness inside the stillness, the window that every long-range shooter lived for and learned to hold and learned to fire inside. 15 seconds. The lead vehicle hit the final straight section before the apex of the second switchback. At this speed, it would reach her stop point in 10 seconds. She tracked it. The reticle moved with the vehicle, compensating for its lateral movement across her line of fire, adjusting for the downward angle, the wind, the temperature. She had calculated these numbers twice in the last 4 minutes and run them again now, and they agreed. 5 seconds. The vehicle entered the apex of the switchback curve. The road narrowed around it on both sides. The driver began to cut the wheel for the turn. She fired. The suppressed shot crossed 1,680 meters in slightly under 2 seconds. She watched through the scope and saw the vehicle's hood jump, the engine block taking the round, the vehicle lurching hard right, the front end dropping as the wheel assembly collapsed on one side. The truck skidded, its rear swinging wide on the loose gravel of the road surface, and came to a stop angled across both lanes of the road with its nose against the rock face and its passenger side hanging over the 9-meter drop. Exactly where she needed it. The vehicles behind it braked hard. She could see the brake lights, hot rectangles in the thermal image, as the second truck stopped 10 meters short of the disabled lead vehicle. The third stopped behind the second. Doors opened. Men began to dismount. "Command, this is Overwatch. Lead vehicle is stopped and blocking at the choke point. Following vehicles are stopped. Personnel are dismounting. I count 8, 10, 12. Copy Overwatch." Morrison's voice was controlled and flat. "Alpha is 3 minutes from extraction. Bravo is 2 minutes." 12 men were out of the vehicles now. She watched them move, disciplined, spreading laterally, using the vehicles as cover. They didn't know where the shot had come from. They were scanning, but they were scanning the ridgelines to the east and south, toward the compound, which was the logical direction from their perspective. She was northeast, above them, 1,680 meters, in a position that, from their current orientation, they weren't looking at. She had perhaps 4 minutes before they organized a proper search, and one of them looked in the right direction. She didn't need 4 minutes. Overwatch to command. "I'm holding the road. Get your people out." Morrison pushed his element hard toward the extraction zone, a flat clearing 600 meters south of the compound, large enough for 2 helicopters, far enough from the walls to reduce the risk of RPG range from the compound roof during the extraction. Bravo element arrived first with the contractors. Both men were on their feet and moving under their own power, which was good. Extraction with ambulatory packages was faster and cleaner than the alternative. One of the contractors had a bandaged hand that looked like it had been broken and reset at an angle that wasn't the original one. He moved anyway, kept pace, didn't complain. Evelyn noted this through the scope as she tracked the road and thought briefly that whatever these men had been through in the past 3 weeks, they had made some kind of accommodation with it that was allowing them to function now. Alpha element came in from the north 60 seconds later, moving fast, tight formation, 2 operators sweeping rear security every 15 meters. Morrison at the front, Webb immediately behind him, the rest of the element compressed into a moving block that covered ground with the specific, controlled urgency of men who were leaving a job site rather than running from one. She kept her attention on the road. The 12 dismounted personnel at the choke point had organized. 3 of them had moved up the slope above the disabled vehicle and were now looking north along the ridgeline, still not in her direction, but closer. 2 others had attempted to push the disabled truck and found it immovable. The front wheel assembly fully collapsed against the rock face with the vehicle's weight pinning it. One of them, a figure who moved with the deliberate authority of someone accustomed to being listened to, was talking into a radio, calling for more vehicles, she estimated, or calling the compound. She didn't know which, and it didn't matter as long as the extraction happened in the next 3 minutes. "Helicopters are 2 minutes out," Echo reported over the net. She watched the extraction zone through the scope. The assault element was inside it, spreading to defensive positions around the perimeter. The contractors were in the center. Morrison was on the radio, coordinating the bird approach. On the road, the figure with the radio finished his transmission. He looked up, looked north along the ridgeline. Then slowly he turned. His head moved in an arc, south, east, up, northeast. He stopped. She couldn't see his face at this range, not clearly, but she could see the orientation of his body and the stillness that had come into it, and she recognized what that stillness meant because she had felt it herself. The moment when a search that has been looking in the wrong direction suddenly finds the right one. He raised a hand and pointed, at the ridgeline where she was lying. "Overwatch to command," she said. Her voice was flat. "Road element has my position. I'm compromised." "Copy. Helicopters are 90 seconds. She heard shouting from the road, faint at this distance, not words, just the sound of men receiving an order. Two of the figures on the road's slope began moving upward, toward her. She shifted the scope to the extraction zone. The helicopters were not yet visible, but she could hear them. The deep rhythmic percussion of rotors coming in low and fast from the south, following the valley floor to reduce exposure. 30 seconds, maybe 40. On the slope below, the two figures were climbing, fast. Too far to reach her before the birds arrived, but fast enough to make the extraction window uncomfortable. She looked at the road. The figure who had found her was now directing the others, some toward the slope, some back toward the vehicles. He was doing what a good commander did, which was adapt quickly to new information and redistribute resources to address it. She respected it. She also needed to complicate his next few minutes. She shifted the rifle, fired twice at the rear vehicle, one round through the engine block, one through the right front tire. The vehicle dropped. Even if they pushed the lead truck clear, they now had two immovable objects on a road too narrow to bypass. The shouts below changed in character. "Extraction zone, go!" Morrison said over the net. She heard the helicopters clearly now, loud, close, the sound bouncing off the valley walls and arriving from multiple directions simultaneously. She held her position for 30 more seconds, watching the slope below. The two figures climbing toward her had slowed. They'd heard the helicopters and understood what those sounds meant for their timeline. Then she was moving. She broke position the way she had been trained, scope cover on, rifle slung muzzle down, pack up, and moving in a single motion that didn't allow for hesitation or the second guessing of a plan she had already made. She moved south along the ridge, away from the climbing figures, dropping into a draw that put stone between her and the road. Fast. The knee complained. She moved faster. Her extraction point was 800 meters from the overwatch position, a secondary clearing that Morrison had designated for her specifically because her overwatch position was too far from the primary zone for a direct run. A single helicopter would break off from the extraction flight after depositing the assault element and come back for her. She reached the clearing in 9 minutes. Her breathing was elevated and her knee was a specific, focused complaint, and she was aware of both these things and of neither of them in any way that mattered. The helicopter came in from the south 3 minutes later, no lights. She identified it by the sound signature and popped a single IR chem light that would be visible to the pilot's night vision and invisible to the naked eye. The bird flared and touched down. She ran the last 40 meters and got on. The helicopter was lifting before she'd fully seated herself. Below, through the open door, she could see the road. The two vehicles blocked in the switchback, immovable. Small figures moving around them. A lot of ground between those figures and the extraction zone. She let out a breath. Through her earpiece, the net was busy. Helicopters coordinating, Echo at Blackridge tracking their approach. The contractors being assessed by a medic on the primary bird. Fragments of the operational picture being reassembled into a complete image now that the immediate danger had passed. Morrison's voice came on the command net, addressed to the element at large. "Good work. All personnel accounted for. Both packages secure." She leaned her head back against the hull and closed her eyes. The helicopter banked hard east, climbing toward the ridgeline, and the cold air that came through the open door was sharp and clean and tasted like altitude, and like the particular, exhaled relief of a job that had required everything and received it. She thought about the road, the timing. The figures who had found her position, 4 minutes earlier than she'd estimated, which was a variable she hadn't fully weighted. She ran it back through her head the way she always did, not looking for vindication but looking for the error, the assumption that hadn't held, the number she'd gotten wrong. 4 minutes. She had estimated 4 minutes before the figure with the radio located her. He'd done it in something closer to 2.5. His search pattern had been faster and more systematic than she'd credited. She filed that. Not as failure, the outcome had been what it needed to be. But the gap between her estimate and the reality was a gap, and gaps were how people died, and she had built her career on closing them. The helicopter leveled out above the ridgeline and the mountains fell away below. In the east, the sky had begun to change. Not light yet, not anything close to light, but the absolute blackness of 0300 had shifted to something marginally less than absolute, the first intimation of a sunrise that was still an hour away. She kept her eyes closed and let the vibration of the aircraft work through her shoulders and thought about nothing at all. Blackridge was 20 minutes out. Somewhere on the primary helicopter, the two contractors who had been held for 3 weeks were riding back toward a world that had continued without them. Somewhere in the compound below, a man named Rashid Kamal was not going to cause any more problems for anyone. And on the road north of the valley, 12 men and 2 disabled vehicles were trying to figure out what had just happened to them. She opened her eyes. The mountains outside the door were enormous and dark, and the stars above them were the kind of stars you only saw at altitude, sharp, overcrowded, indifferent. She looked at them for a moment, then she looked at her hands. They were steady. They were always steady. She didn't know if that was a good thing about her or something else entirely. She had stopped being sure about that distinction a long time ago, somewhere in the 9th year of doing work that required her hands to be exactly this steady at exactly the moments when steadiness was hardest to maintain. The helicopter descended toward Black Ridge. Below, the station's lights appeared. Small, practical, the red and white geometry of a place designed for function rather than welcome. She began checking her gear, pack, rifle, radio. Everything present, everything functional. The routine of it was its own kind of anchor, the small, repeated acts of accountability that structured the aftermath of operations, the way the preparation structured the approach. The helicopter touched down with its characteristic controlled thump. Through the door, she could see the primary birds already down, rotor wash still dying, the assault element beginning to offload. 2 figures with a stretcher moved toward the contractors. A medic. A second figure she couldn't identify at this distance. She stepped off the helicopter. The tarmac was cold and dark and smelled like aviation fuel and the particular mineral dryness of mountain air before dawn. She walked toward the operations building because that was where the debrief would begin, and because there was nowhere else particularly useful to be. She was 20 meters from the ops building door when she heard boots behind her, moving fast. She didn't stop or turn. She had learned a long time ago that turning toward running footsteps in the dark outside a forward operating base was an invitation to a different kind of problem. Carter. Webb's voice. She stopped, turned. He was alone. Still in his kit, helmet off, rifle slung. He stopped 3 meters away and stood there with his jaw tight and his arms at his sides and the look of a man who had something he needed to say and was not sure he had the right language for it. She waited. "The road," he said finally. "The stop. What about it?" "I was on the extraction net. I heard the timeline." A pause. "If you'd missed, if that truck had gotten past the choke point, I didn't miss." "I know." He looked at the ground for a moment, then back at her. "I know you didn't." Another pause, shorter. "I gave you a harder time than I should have." She looked at him. His face was doing the work of a man who found this kind of admission genuinely difficult and was doing it anyway, which told her something real about him. "You didn't trust the situation," she said. "That's your job." "My job is to run the assault element, deciding whether to trust someone I don't know anything about." He stopped, started again. "I made that decision based on things that had nothing to do with your ability." She held his gaze for a moment. She had been in this conversation before, different faces, different forward bases, the same essential structure. The apology that came after. She had learned not to be warm about it, because warmth suggested that what had been done before the apology was small enough to be dissolved by it. It wasn't. But she also knew that a man standing in the dark on a tarmac at Yo 400, still in his kit, saying the words he was saying, was doing something that cost him something. She could acknowledge that without making it more than it was. "We got them out," she said. Webb nodded once, looked at the ops building. "Debrief's in 20 minutes. I'll be there." He turned and walked back toward the element. She watched him go. Then she turned back to the ops building, pulled the door open, and walked into the light. The operations building was brighter than it had any right to be at 0400, the overhead fluorescents running at full power the way they always did when a debrief was incoming, as if light could accelerate clarity, or at least simulate it. Evelyn set her rifle in the corner rack, dropped her pack against the wall, and poured herself coffee from the urn near the door. It was burnt. She drank it anyway. The room filled in stages. The assault element came in still carrying the controlled release energy of men who had been at full operational tempo for the past 4 hours and hadn't yet had time to let it go. Briggs dropped into a chair with the weight of someone whose legs had made a decision independent of his will. Coletti sat beside him and immediately began working a knot out of his left shoulder with his right hand, his face doing the thing faces did when the pain was real, but complaining about it wasn't on the table. Torres was talking quietly with Kessler near the map table, reconstruction already beginning. The particular post-operation habit of going back through it while the details were still sharp, before sleep and time smoothed the edges. Morrison stood at the front of the room with Specialist Rao beside him. Rao had a tablet and a fresh set of satellite imagery. She had been working the intelligence picture from Blackridge while the operation ran and was the most informed person in the room about what had happened on the ground, in the specific, frustrating way that the person watching the cameras was always more informed than the people inside the building. Webb came in last. He took a position against the wall rather than sitting, standing debrief posture, which in a man like Webb communicated that he was keeping himself at readiness rather than winding down. He looked at Evelyn once when he entered, not in a way that required a response. She didn't give one. "All right," Morrison said, no preamble. "Full debrief, start to finish. I want everything on the record before anyone sleeps." He walked the room through it chronologically. Insertion, approach, compound entry, the contact on the second floor, Kamal's attempted flight, the elimination, the hostage extraction. His account was precise and unembellished, and he was generous with credit to the element members who had performed well. He was also honest about the 2 minutes on the second floor where the assault had stalled because the door at the top of the stairs had been reinforced in a way the imagery hadn't shown, and a different approach had to be improvised under fire. "Webb," he said, "walk me through the stall on the second floor." Webb pushed off the wall. His account was equally spare. The reinforced door, the pivot to a secondary entry point through the window on the exterior face, the 30-second delay that had felt longer than it was. His voice was flat and professional and gave nothing away about what the 30 seconds had actually felt like from the inside. Then Morrison looked at Evelyn. "Overwatch." She walked them through it. Roof guard, the pre-breach elimination, the road monitoring, the vehicles. She gave the exact numbers, ranges, timings, wind readings, the adjustment from the original choke point to the preferred stop location. She was precise about the timing gap. Her estimate of 4 minutes before the road element located her position versus the actual 2.5. "I underestimated their search pattern," she said. "I gave them a standard sector sweep timeline. Their commander ran a faster, more systematic pattern. I should have weighted that possibility more heavily given the convoy discipline I observed." The room was quiet. Not the awkward quiet of people processing a failure. The more particular quiet of people listening to someone articulate a gap in their own performance with complete accuracy and no defensiveness. "It didn't affect the outcome," Morrison said. "This time," she said. He nodded. That was all. He understood exactly what she meant and didn't belabor it. The debrief ran 40 minutes. At the end, Morrison called it and told the element to get 4 hours of sleep before the follow-on brief at 1,000. People began to move. Chairs scraped. Someone's radio went off and was immediately silenced. Coletti paused beside her on his way out. He had the look of a man assembling something to say, which she had noticed was a thing he did. He didn't speak quickly or impulsively. He built it first. "The choke point call," he said. "In the brief, before any of us knew what you could do." A pause. "That was the tell, wasn't it? You'd already run the whole thing in your head before you said a word." She looked at him. "Go sleep, Sergeant." He almost smiled again. He was getting closer to it each time. She slept 3 hours and 40 minutes. It wasn't enough, and it was what was available, and she had learned at 24 years old that the correct relationship to insufficient sleep was to take what existed and use it rather than to want more of it. She was awake and moving before the wake-up call, rifle cleaned and repackaged, kit squared, the room returned to the state she had found it in. The 1,000 brief was a different kind of meeting. Not operational planning, but the beginning of the assessment cycle that followed every completed mission. Morrison ran it, Rao supported it, and the intelligence picture that came out of the night's operation was more complex than the picture going in. The compound had yielded documentation, paper and digital, both. Rao's initial read indicated that Kamal's network was more distributed than previously understood. Not 3 active cells, but closer to 7, spread across 2 provinces, with logistics channels that ran through a supply chain everyone had thought was civilian. The two rescued contractors had been working in that supply chain, which was why they'd been taken. They knew things. "We're going to need follow-on targeting," Morrison said. "This doesn't end with Kamal." A subdued acknowledgement moved through the room. They had known this was the probable outcome. Closing one node in a network that size meant the network simply rerouted. "Timeline on the documentation analysis?" Webb asked. 48 to 72 hours for initial product, Rao said. "Full assessment will take longer. We're working with higher on priority tasking." Morrison looked at the room. "We stay at Blackridge until further notice. Maintain operational readiness." His eyes moved briefly to Evelyn. "That includes our Overwatch asset." She nodded. The session broke up, and she spent the next 6 hours in a rhythm she had established at every forward base she'd ever worked from. Equipment maintenance, physical work to counteract the accumulated tightness of the Overwatch position, study of the new intelligence product as Rao pushed it to the shared terminal, and the ongoing low-grade mental processing of the night's operation that happened whether she directed it or not. At 1600, she was at the terminal when Rao appeared beside her. "Can I ask you something?" Evelyn looked at her. Rao was mid-20s, precise, the kind of analytical mind that processed everything as data and occasionally seemed surprised when data produced human consequences. She had been professional and accurate throughout the operation. She had also been the one to confirm Evelyn's firing solution correction in the brief, and the directness of that confirmation, delivered without hedging or softening, had been noticed. "Go ahead," Evelyn said. "The crosswind geometry at the alternate stop point. When you called that in the brief, you hadn't seen the full terrain model. You'd had maybe 5 minutes with the topographic map." A pause. "How?" Evelyn considered the question for a moment. Not the answer, the question. What it was asking versus what it appeared to be asking. "Experience," she said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." She turned back to the terminal. "The math is the math. You either know it well enough that the terrain talks to you or you don't. The map gives you the numbers. The numbers give you the geometry. The geometry gives you the wind component." A pause. "I've been doing this long enough that I skip the middle steps." Rao was quiet for a moment. "How long?" Evelyn didn't answer that. Rao took the non-answer with the equanimity of someone who processed silences as data points rather than rejections and left. The second night at Blackridge was uneventful in the operational sense, and not uneventful in any other sense. Dinner in the common building produced the first moment of something approaching normalcy. Men who had operated together through the night, sitting in the same space with food, and the particular looseness that followed sustained tension when the tension was resolved. Stories appeared, not about the operation, those would stay on the record and off the table, but about other operations, other bases, the specific absurdist comedy of military life that everyone who had lived it accumulated like sediment. Briggs told a story about a navigation error in training that had deposited his entire element in the middle of a civilian agricultural fair in rural Georgia. Coletti had a response story that was clearly meant to top it and nearly succeeded. Torres laughed hard enough at something that his coffee went somewhere it wasn't supposed to. Evelyn sat at the far end of the table with her tray and ate and listened. Webb sat at the other end. He didn't tell stories. He ate efficiently and listened to the others with the focused attention of a man who was genuinely interested in the people around him even when he wasn't participating. He looked at her twice in the course of the meal, neither time with hostility. The first look was just acknowledgement. "You're here, I'm here, this is the space we're in." The second was harder to read, and she didn't try. After dinner, Morrison found her outside the common building. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee that were marginally better than the ones available at 0300, which placed them somewhere in the category of acceptable. He handed her one without asking. She took it. They stood in the cold outside the building, looking at the mountains. The night was clear, the stars absurdly thick, the kind of sky that only existed above 6,000 feet with no light pollution for 100 kilometers in any direction. "Rao thinks your background is SOG," Morrison said. "Special Operations Group, agency side." "What do you think?" "I think your background is whatever it is, and the classification exists for a reason." A pause. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "But after last night, the roof guard, the timing on the road, The way you held that position after you were compromised. I've been running the numbers on what kind of program produces someone who operates at that level. She didn't respond. The program I keep coming back to, he said, doesn't exist anymore. Officially. She drank her coffee. Or maybe it still exists and the officially is doing a lot of work, he said. Commander? Yeah. I can't discuss my background. I know. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not asking you to. Another pause. I just want you to know, whatever it is, last night it mattered. The contractors are alive. My people are alive. That's the whole equation. She looked at the mountains. The ridgeline where she had lain for 3 hours in the cold, watching through a scope, calculating numbers that no one would ever ask to verify because the outcome had rendered the process invisible. I know, she said. Morrison finished his coffee, set the empty cup on the plywood railing beside him. Follow-on targeting brief is tomorrow at 0800. Rao's getting initial product from hire tonight. He paused. I'd like you in that brief. Not as an observer, she said. Not as an observer, he confirmed. He went back inside. She stayed outside for a while longer, drinking the coffee and looking at the mountains and not thinking about anything in particular, which was the closest she got to rest when sleep wasn't available. The follow-on brief at 0800 changed the operational picture in ways that compressed the timeline significantly. Rao had worked through the night, the documentation from the compound, cross-referenced against existing intelligence, and the initial statements from the two contractors indicated that one of Kamal's 7 identified cells was not in a static location. It was mobile. It moved on a 4 to 6 day cycle between 3 locations in the eastern part of the province, using a transportation pattern that mimicked civilian logistics. And based on the movement data extracted from Kamal's documentation, that cell was due to make a transition in approximately 36 hours. If they missed the window, the cell would go to ground and potentially not resurface for months. The cell leader is a man named Farouk Nasir, Rao said, putting the photograph on the screen. Mid-30s, former military, technically competent. He manages the financial side of the network, funding transfers, payment logistics. Taking him doesn't decapitate the network, but it removes a critical function and gives us access to the financial architecture. What's the capture versus kill calculus? Webb asked. Hire wants him alive if possible. The financial architecture is worth more as something he talks about than as something we reconstruct from his documents. Location? Third transition point, here. Rao indicated a village in the eastern highlands, smaller than the compound they had hit the night before, less fortified, but in terrain that was significantly more complex. A tight valley, no viable helicopter insertion point within 4 kilometers, which meant an approach on foot over terrain that the topographic map indicated was serious. Overwatch options? Morrison asked, looking at Evelyn. She was already studying the map. The village sat in a valley bowl with high ground on 3 sides. The 4th side, the approach from the west, was the only viable entry for the assault element, which also made it the obvious direction from which Nasir's people would expect trouble. Northeast ridgeline, she said, indicating a point on the map. Higher than the others, longer range to the target structure, approximately 2,100 meters, but it gives me coverage of the eastern approach road, the village perimeter, and the only viable reinforcement route from the south. A pause. It also gives me a sight angle on the western approach that overlaps with the assault element's route. I can cover their approach and the target simultaneously from that position. Range: 2,100 to target, 1,400 to the assault element's final approach corridor. The room was quiet for a moment. 2,100 meters was not a number that generated comfort. That's a long shot, Briggs said. He said it as a statement rather than a challenge, but the weight behind it was real. It's within my capability, Evelyn said. Briggs looked at the table for a moment, looked up. Yeah, he said. Okay. Morrison absorbed the plan. He asked 3 more questions about terrain, timing, and radio coverage in the target valley, all of them practical and specific, none of them about her. Then he began building the operation. The planning session ran 4 hours. By the end of it, she had a complete operational picture: insertion timeline, assault element composition, contingency routes, extraction planning. She also had 45 minutes of independent study time with Rao's terrain analysis before the room broke for equipment prep. She was using those 45 minutes at the map table when Coletti appeared across from her. He put his coffee down and looked at the map without speaking for a moment. Northeast ridgeline, he said. That approach from the insertion point, that's 3 kilometers minimum, in that terrain, at night. Yes. You'll need to be at position before we're at breach. I know. That's a tight timeline. She looked at him across the map. Are you concerned about my timeline or yours? He made the almost smile again. Mine. You already told me not to worry about yours. That surprised her slightly. She didn't let it show. Your approach vector through the western corridor. There's a drainage feature here. She indicated a point on the map. The satellite imagery shows it dry, but the terrain upstream suggests seasonal flow. If it ran recently, the bottom will be soft. Night navigation through a soft drainage in full kit with noise discipline. How much soft? Unknown, but worth probing before you commit your element to it. If you bog down in the drainage at the wrong moment, I lose my timing on the breach. He was looking at the map now with the full attention of a professional taking new information seriously. I'll flag it for Morrison. Do that. He nodded, picked up his coffee, paused. Can I ask you something? You're going to regardless. Webb said you told him you don't miss. She looked at him. Do you believe that? He asked. Or is that something you say? The question was more serious than it sounded. She could tell from the way he held it, not casually, not as banter, but as a genuine inquiry from a man whose own professional life depended on the difference between confidence and delusion. I believe in my preparation, she said. I believe in my process. I don't miss is shorthand for that. A pause. It's also something you say in situations where the alternative is explaining all of that, which takes longer than is useful. Coletti considered this. And last night, the roof guard. First shot. First shot. In the dark. At a moving target. Before breach. Which means if you miss, I know what happens if I miss. He was quiet for a moment. That's a weight to carry. Yes, she said. It is. Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, nothing like pity, but a recognition. The look of someone who understood weight because he carried his own version of it and had just found a point of contact with a person he'd underestimated. He picked up his coffee and left. She turned back to the map. The operation launched at 22100. Different birds this time, smaller, faster, a configuration optimized for the terrain around the target valley. The insertion point was a ridge saddle 4 kilometers from the village, chosen because it was the closest flat ground large enough for a helicopter to use without noise carrying into the valley bowl. The flight was shorter and rougher than the previous night. Mountain turbulence at 2100 in the eastern highlands was a different animal than the relatively stable air of the 0200 insertion. Thermals collapsing, cold air draining into valleys from the high ground. The birds fighting for stable air in ways that showed in the way the fuselage moved under her. She spent the flight doing what she had done the night before. Numbers. The range. The angle. The expected wind at the northeast ridgeline based on the EMET data Rao had pulled. The approach. 3 kilometers over terrain she had studied for 3 hours and would now navigate for the first time. The helicopter touched down and she was off before the skids had fully settled, moving fast, the rest of the element offloading behind her. Morrison said nothing. She said nothing. She turned northeast and started climbing. The approach to the overwatch position was harder than the previous nights. The terrain was more complex, broken, layered, with false ridge lines that required her to approach, assess, and redirect twice before she found the correct line to the summit of the northeast ridge. The shale was sharper here, the slopes steeper in sections. Her left knee made itself known consistently, and she moved through it consistently. She reached the overwatch position at 2247. 13 minutes before the assault element was due at the village perimeter. She built the position in 8 minutes. Smaller shelf than the previous night, less ideal geometry, but oriented correctly, and with the sight line she needed. She glassed the village. 17 heat signatures, more than the brief had anticipated. Overwatch to command. I have 17 bodies in the village, not the estimated 12. Additional 5. I'm reading them in the northern cluster of buildings, which the brief assessed as storage. A pause on Morrison's end. Copy. Rao, you seeing this? Rao's voice from Blackridge. Updating now. The northern buildings. The infrared from this morning showed them cold. Someone moved in since the last pass. Are they armed? Morrison asked. Evelyn studied the signatures. The 5 figures in the northern buildings were not moving with the relaxed irregularity of people sleeping or waiting. They were stationary in positions that suggested they're sitting in a pattern that's consistent with a guard element holding a perimeter, equidistant spacing along the northern wall. A pause. Yes, they're armed. Copy. Morrison's voice changed, not in tone, just in the quality of focus behind it. Element, adjust. We have additional security in the northern cluster. Webb, modify your secondary approach to account for contact north of the main structure. Copy, Webb said, adjusting. Overwatch, I need you to be able to cover the northern cluster if we take contact from that direction. She shifted. The northern cluster of buildings was 1,170 meters from her position. Closer than the main target structure, better angle, the crosswind component favorable. I have coverage. Good. We are at the perimeter in 6 minutes. Stand by. She settled back into the position. 6 minutes. She moved the scope between the main structure, where Rao's documentation placed Nasir, and the northern cluster, reading the heat signatures, building the picture of how these 17 people were distributed and what each position meant for the assault element's approach. The 5 in the north were the problem. Their spacing along the wall was smart. If they were alert, they could detect the assault element's western approach before the breach and give Nasir's security in the main structure time to react. The assault needed those 5 men to not raise an alarm. She keyed her radio. Overwatch to command. The northern guard element, their sight angle on your western approach covers approximately 40% of your final movement corridor. If they're alert and the timing on your breach is standard, they'll see us, Morrison said. He already knew. He was asking her to confirm. Yes. Options. She had been building this in her head since she first saw the heat signatures. I can take the 2 figures at the northwest and northeast corners of the northern cluster simultaneously. She stopped. That was wrong. She couldn't take 2 simultaneous with 1 rifle. She corrected. I can take the northwest corner first, the northeast corner inside 4 seconds. That removes the 2 figures with the longest sight angle on your approach. The remaining 3 are oriented inward. They won't have eyes on your corridor until they respond to the shots. 4 seconds between shots. They'll respond. Yes, but their response will be inward, toward the sound. Your element will already be moving. Silence for 3 seconds. She counted them. Do it, Morrison said. On my mark. Mark in 90 seconds. Copy. She settled on the northwest corner figure. 1,870 meters, slight downhill angle. The wind at this altitude was steadier than the previous night. Consistent northwest at 11 knots, minimal variation. She ran the numbers. The reticle settled. In her earpiece, the command net was quiet. The assault element was in position, waiting. Below in the village, 17 people were going about whatever they were doing, none of them knowing that 31 other people had organized themselves around this specific valley tonight. Morrison's voice. Mark in 30. She adjusted fractionally, exhaled. Let the respiratory pause extend. Mark in 10. She moved her focus forward. Not to the target, to the space behind the target, the neutral space, where the eye goes when the body takes over the mechanical sequence it has performed 10,000 times. Mark! She fired. Cycled the bolt in the same motion, the scope already swinging east to the northeast corner figure, the reticle finding the heat signature at 1,170 meters. The wind still consistent, the angle still favorable. She fired. 3 seconds between shots, not 4. 2 down, north cluster, she said. Below, the remaining 3 figures in the northern cluster had responded exactly as she'd predicted. They turned inward, weapons coming up, focused on the direction of the sound. The assault element was already moving through the western corridor. Alpha is moving, Morrison said. Bravo, northern cluster, go. 2 of the Rangers broke off toward the northern buildings at a run. She covered them through the scope, watching the 3 remaining figures in the cluster who were now facing the wrong direction. The Rangers hit the northern cluster in 40 seconds. She heard the controlled compression of suppressed weapons and then the net went sharp with Bravo's status calls. Contact north, 2 down, 1 in custody. The figure in custody was one of the 3 she had seen. She didn't know which one until Bravo's element leader called it. We have a talker. He's giving it up. Northern Cluster was a secondary security element for the main structure. Copy, Morrison said. Alpha, we have a talker. Nasser may be moving. Accelerate. Alpha hit the main structure. The next 4 minutes were the operational net at its most compressed, a stream of short, controlled transmissions that built a picture she could only partially see from her overwatch position, the rest assembled from sound and data. Contact on the ground floor, 2 guards down, assault element pushing. A locked room. Webb's voice calling a breach. An explosion, small, controlled, a breaching charge. And then, room is clear. 1 male, restrained. Rao, I need an ident. Rao's voice from Blackridge. Send me a face. 8 seconds. That's Nasir. That's your man. The village went quiet. Or nearly quiet. She was still watching the remaining heat signatures. The 12 who weren't part of the security element clustered in the eastern buildings, some of them moving now in the agitated way of people who had heard things they didn't understand and were trying to decide what to do about them. Overwatch? I have civilian movement in the eastern buildings, she said. 12 signatures, non-aggressive orientation, but they're active. Copy, Morrison said. Element? We are at extraction. Northern Road. Is it clear? She swung the scope. The road was empty. Clear. Go. They moved. She held her position and covered the village for the 7 minutes it took the assault element to move Nasir and the contractors, 2 additional civilians from the village who Bravo had identified as potential network members, to the extraction point. She watched the eastern buildings. The civilians there did not produce weapons. They stayed inside. Smart people making smart decisions in a situation they didn't fully understand. The helicopter came in low from the west. She watched the extraction through the scope, the assault element loading, Nasser under control, the element leader's final head count, the bird lifting. Then the second bird for Bravo. Then, in the distance, a third bird swinging north toward her extraction point. She was already moving, breaking position, pack up, and moving south along the ridge toward the secondary clearing she had identified during planning. The knee, the shale, the cold. These were the consistent facts of the job, and she moved through them the way she always did. She reached the clearing in 11 minutes. The helicopter was already there, hovering 2 meters off the ground, the pilot not wanting to fully commit to the landing in the dark, because the clearing was marginal, barely large enough, with a slope on the southern edge that made the geometry uncomfortable. She ran the last 30 meters and got on. The bird climbed away from the ridge and turned southwest toward Blackridge, and she leaned back against the hull and let the vibration move through her shoulders and looked at the sky through the open door. 2 operations, 2 nights, both packages accounted for. Nasir alive and in custody with financial architecture that would take analysts weeks to unpack. She should have felt something clear about that, relief, or the functional equivalent of it. The satisfaction of work completed correctly. What she felt instead was the specific, hollow exhaustion that came after sustained high-intensity focus, the drawdown of every resource she had spent over 48 hours, hitting her now all at once in a way she hadn't allowed during the operations themselves. Her hands, when she looked at them, were still steady. They were always steady. But the rest of her understood that the steadiness had cost something, and that cost was being presented now as a bill. She looked at the mountains below, enormous, dark, the same mountains they had always been before anyone had organized a military operation around them. Nasser's face in the scope when they pulled him out of the room. The specific expression of a man who had been very good at staying invisible and had just discovered that invisibility had a limit. She had seen that expression before. She would see it again. The helicopter descended toward Blackridge. She was already thinking about the intelligence product that Nasir would generate, the 5 remaining cells, the financial architecture, the next target, which was already somewhere in that architecture, waiting for Rao to find it. The tarmac came up and the bird touched down. She stepped off into the cold pre-dawn air and started walking toward the operations building, and she was 3 meters from the door when she heard the sound behind her. Not running footsteps this time. Not one person, but multiple. The particular cadence of a group moving with shared purpose. She stopped, turned. The assault element was behind her. All of them. Webb, Briggs, Coletti, Torres, Kessler, the entire element, still in their kit, arranged in a loose formation on the tarmac. They had come off the primary birds, and instead of going inside, they had stayed. Morrison was at the front. He looked at her across the 15 meters of tarmac between them for a moment. Then he raised his hand in a formal military salute. She stood very still. Behind Morrison, one by one, the rest of the element followed. Webb, Briggs, Coletti. Every operator on the tarmac, in their kit, in the dark before dawn, raising their right hand. The tarmac was completely quiet except for the dying sound of the helicopters. She had been in this work for 9 years. She had operated in 7 countries across 4 continents in programs so classified that her own service record was fragmented across 4 separate security architectures. She had held positions in terrain that would have been considered impossible, made shots that would never appear in any after-action report, carried the weight of decisions that would never be acknowledged by anyone with the authority to acknowledge them. Nobody had ever done this. She raised her hand and returned the salute. Her arm was steady, her face was composed. But something behind her sternum, something she had kept contained through 2 nights of operations and 48 hours of being assessed and doubted and ultimately used in the way she had been built to be used, that thing moved. She didn't let it show. She had long since learned not to let it show. But it moved. The salute held for 5 seconds, maybe 6. Then Morrison dropped his hand. The element followed. Nobody said anything. She turned and walked through the operations building door. Inside, alone, in the brief moment before anyone followed her in, she stood with her hand against the wall and breathed, once, twice. Then she straightened, picked up her pack, and walked to the debrief table. The work was not done. It was never done. But someone had seen it. For once, someone had seen it. The debrief started at 04:30, and nobody complained about the hour. Evelyn sat at the end of the table where she always sat, the position that gave her a clear sight line to the door and the screen simultaneously, the position she had chosen on the first night without thinking about it, and that had become hers by repetition. Morrison at the head. Rao with her tablet. Webb on the wall again, standing, though the reason for it now felt different than it had 2 nights ago. Then it had been the posture of a man keeping himself at readiness against an unknown variable. Now it looked more like the posture of a man who thought better on his feet. Coletti had coffee. Torres had his eyes half closed and his hands wrapped around a mug and was fully present despite the appearance otherwise. She had figured that out about him in the first hour of the first night and had filed it. Briggs looked at his hands. Morrison started talking. He ran the second operation with the same spare precision he brought to everything. The timeline, the contact, the modified northern approach, Nasir's capture. He was methodical and accurate, and when he got to the moment she had taken the 2 figures from the northern cluster in sequence, he simply stated it as an operational fact. Overwatch eliminated 2 northern security personnel in a 3-second window, creating the approach corridor for Alpha. 3 seconds. She had said 4 when she'd planned it. She had done it in 3. Nobody said anything about that discrepancy. It was in the room, briefly, and then the debrief moved forward and it passed. When it was her turn, she walked the room through the Overwatch sequence from position establishment to departure. She was precise. She was accurate about what had gone well and what she would have done differently. Specifically, the timing on her identification of the northern cluster signatures. She had confirmed 17 bodies when she had originally reported 12. The delta had been 5. She had identified and reported it in time for Morrison to adjust. But she should have had eyes on that cluster from the first scope up, before she confirmed the main structure count. I sequenced the main structure first, she said. The brief placed Nasir there, and I prioritized the primary target location. The northern cluster was a secondary reference. I should have run both simultaneously from the first pass. Morrison looked at her. It didn't affect the outcome. It could have. Acknowledged. He moved on. That was how professionals debriefed. Not with self-flagellation and not with defensiveness. You found the gap, you named it accurately, you moved forward. She had worked with people on both ends of that failure. The ones who couldn't admit a gap and the ones who couldn't stop examining it. And both of them were liabilities in different ways. The debrief ran until 06:10. By the end of it, the sun was coming through the eastern windows of the operations building in the way that mountain sun arrived, hard and sudden, like someone had made a decision about it. Morrison called it. Get some sleep. I want everyone at 1300 for intelligence product review. Rao is going to walk us through the first read on Nasser's materials. People moved. Evelyn began to stand. Carter. Morrison. Stay. She sat back down. The room emptied. Rao remained, which was notable. Rao didn't stay for things that weren't relevant to her function, which meant Morrison had asked her to stay in advance. Close the door, Morrison said to no one in particular. Coletti, last out, pulled it shut. The three of them were alone. Morrison sat forward in his chair with his elbows on the table and looked at her in a way that was different from any of the previous looks. Not assessing, not recalibrated, just direct. The look of someone who had made a decision about what kind of conversation this was going to be and was committed to it. I made some calls this morning, he said, before the debrief. What kind of calls? The kind that required me to use authorization codes I've only used twice in 12 years. He paused. I wanted to understand who I'd been running operations with. She kept her face level. And I got farther than I expected to. Which tells me either my clearance has been quietly upgraded and nobody told me, or he stopped. Or the people who hold your record decided that given what you just did in 2 nights with my element, it was appropriate for me to have some context. What did you find? Morrison looked at the table for a moment. When he looked back up, something in his expression had shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible but wasn't. Program 7, he said. The room was very quiet. Rao looked at her tablet. Not reading it, just not looking at either of them. Evelyn said nothing. Program 7 was a joint development initiative, Morrison continued. Special operations and a particular intelligence agency whose name I'm not going to say in this room. It ran for 11 years. Objective was to develop a specific capability profile. Long-range precision engagement, autonomous operational planning, zero support fieldwork. Operators trained to function completely independently in denied access environments for extended periods. A pause. No team. No forward base. No support element. 1 person, 1 rifle, and an objective. He stopped and waited. She looked at the table, looked at him, made a decision. Program 7 is classified above the level of anything we can discuss in this room, she said. I know. Then you know I can't confirm or deny anything about it. I know that too. Morrison laced his fingers together on the table. I'm not asking you to confirm anything. I'm telling you what I found, and I'm telling you that what I found explains every question I've had since you walked through my gate 2 days ago. He paused. The clearance that the gate Marine couldn't read. The classified record that doesn't cross-reference to any unit, any branch, any standard training pipeline. The skill profile that Kessler, who I'd put up against anyone, described to me this morning as the best thing he'd ever seen in a field environment. He looked at her steadily. 11 years, Carter. That's what the timeline suggests. 11 years in something that officially doesn't exist. She held his gaze. Commander. Yeah. What do you want from this conversation? He was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to understand why a program with that capability profile assigned one of their people to support a standard direct action element. No offense to my team, they're exceptional, but they're not the kind of operation that typically draws this level of support. It was a fair question. She had asked herself a version of it when the assignment had come through. The Kamal network, she said. The financial architecture. The 7 cells. She paused. There are things in Nasser's materials that Rao hasn't found yet, that the standard analytical process will eventually find, but not quickly enough given the operational window. She looked at Rao. How long will the full assessment take? Your honest estimate. Rao looked up from the tablet. Full network mapping, accounting for all 7 cells, cross-referenced against the financial data? 6 to 8 weeks. Possibly 10. And during those 6 to 8 weeks, Evelyn said, the remaining 6 cells will be active. They'll know Kamal is dead. They'll know Nasser is taken. They'll adapt. The financial architecture will change. The cell locations will shift. She looked back at Morrison. My assignment to your element was not about supporting a direct action operation. It was about being in the building when Nasser's materials came out of that compound. The room absorbed this. Rao was looking at her now with the specific expression of someone whose analytical picture has just been reorganized around a new piece of information. "You know what's in those materials," Rao said. It wasn't a question. "I know what to look for." "How?" Evelyn considered how much of this was speakable, decided on the minimum that was actually useful. The financial architecture Nasser manages is not unique. It's a variation of a model that's been used by 3 other networks across 2 regions in the past 7 years. I've been involved in the dismantling of 2 of them. The third is partially dismantled and some of its infrastructure migrated into this network. She paused. "I know the signatures, the account structures, the transfer patterns, the timing cycles. In Nasir's materials, I can find in 48 hours what your analytical process would find in 6 weeks." The room was very quiet. Morrison looked at her for a long moment. "Why didn't your handlers tell me this when you were assigned?" "Because if you'd known what my actual role was, your operational behavior would have changed. My effectiveness in the Overwatch position depended on me being exactly what I appeared to be, the Overwatch asset, nothing more." She paused. "And because the compartmentalization is the point. The fewer people who understand the full picture, the fewer points of failure," Morrison said. "Yes." He sat back. He was doing the thing she had watched him do throughout the 2 nights of operations, processing, recalibrating, building a new picture with the information at hand. He was good at it, faster than most. "Oh, the 2 operations," he said. "Kamal, Nasir. Those were always leading to this, to the materials." "Yes." "And your Overwatch role was real. The operations were real. The team needed covering, and I was the right person to cover them." She held his gaze. "Those weren't competing priorities. They were the same priority." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You could have told me this." "I couldn't, Commander. Not without authorization I don't have." "You could have told me there was a second objective." "Same problem." He worked his jaw. She could see him deciding whether to be angry about it. The operational compartmentalization that had kept him partly blind, the asset assigned to his element under incomplete cover. He had the standing to be angry. His people had operated with incomplete information, which was a thing commanders took personally and correctly. "Your people were never at greater risk because of the compartmentalization," she said. "Every decision I made in the field was made on their behalf. The Overwatch coverage was full and real. Nothing was sacrificed to the secondary objective." "I know that," he said. The sharpness in his voice was not accusation. It was the sound of a man working through a legitimate grievance while simultaneously acknowledging that the outcome had been what it needed to be. "I know that. It doesn't make me feel great about being managed." "No," she said. "It shouldn't." He looked at her. "That's a hell of a thing to say." "It's the true thing." A pause. Then something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile but was in the same general territory. "All right," he straightened. "Rao, you're going to work with Carter on the materials analysis starting." He looked at Evelyn. "This afternoon," she said, "after the 1300 brief. I'll need full access to everything that came out of both sites." "You'll have it," Rao said. She was looking at Evelyn with an expression that had reorganized since the beginning of this conversation, not deferential, just recalibrated, professional to professional rather than analyst to unknown asset. Morrison stood. "One more thing." She waited. "The salute this morning." He said it without apparent self-consciousness. "That was the element's decision, mine to initiate, theirs to follow or not. Nobody was ordered to raise their hand." He paused. "I want you to know that." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "That's why it mattered." He nodded once and left. She slept 4 hours. Real sleep this time, not the shallow maintenance rest of the previous nights. The kind that happened when the operational adrenaline had fully burned through and the body was done negotiating about it. She woke at 12:40, squared her kit, and was at the 1300 brief 7 minutes early. The intelligence product review was Rao's territory, and she ran it well. 22 minutes of structured analytical findings from the documentation pulled out of both compounds, delivered with the precise, unsentimental efficiency of someone who understood that clarity was a form of respect for the people in the room. Nasir's financial records were more detailed than the initial field assessment had suggested. Account structures, transfer codes, a partial ledger that covered 18 months of network transactions. When Rao finished, she looked at Evelyn. You want to walk them through what you saw? Not yet. She looked at the ledger images on the screen. I need to work through the full set first. Some of what I'm seeing on the surface is consistent with the architecture I know. Some of it's been modified. I need to understand the modifications before I can give you a reliable map. How long? Give me the afternoon and tonight. Morrison, from the head of the table. You have it. The room broke up. Briggs stopped beside her on his way out. Not a full stop, just a slowing, a half pause. 48 hours, he said, when you walked through the gate. Yes. I almost... He stopped. Started again. When the gate called it in. When you came through with no unit and no weapon. I almost went to Morrison and told him I had concerns about running an operation with an unknown quantity on Overwatch. She looked at him. Why didn't you? He thought about it. Because I didn't have anything specific, just the feeling that something didn't add up. And feelings aren't an operational argument. A pause. But if I had gone to Morrison, if he'd stood you down, he wouldn't have, she said. How do you know? Because he's a better commander than that. He saw the clearance, he read the brief, he trusted the chain that put me there even when the reasoning wasn't visible to him. She paused. Which is what the chain required. Briggs looked at her for a moment. You don't make this easy. Make what easy? Feeling bad about how we handled the first day. She picked up her coffee. You shouldn't feel bad. You responded to incomplete information with appropriate professional skepticism. That's correct behavior. She looked at him directly. What would be incorrect is responding to new information the same way. He worked his jaw, nodded, walked out. She spent 7 hours with the materials. Rao set her up at a secure terminal in the intelligence cell, a smaller room adjacent to the main ops center, quieter, with 2 screens and direct access to the classified network that held the raw documentation from both sites. Rao came and went, checking in every 90 minutes, pulling additional cross-references from the database when Evelyn identified them, running searches that required her analytical access level. It was the kind of work that existed at the opposite end of the spectrum from the Overwatch position. Instead of cold and darkness and the narrow, focused geometry of a firing solution, it was warmth and fluorescent light and the wide, branching complexity of a financial network that had been designed by someone who understood how to make things invisible. She found the first modification in the account structure at hour 2. A routing variation that inserted an additional intermediary layer, clean, professional work, the kind that would have read as noise in a standard analysis. She recognized it because she had seen a version of it in the second network she'd helped dismantle, which meant the person who had designed Nasir's modifications had access to that network's architecture, which meant there was a connection between Nasir's operation and the partially dismantled third network that hadn't previously been identified. She stopped, stared at the screen. Rao. Rao came in from the adjacent room. What? This routing modification. She pointed at the screen. Do you see the intermediary layer here? Rao looked, studied it for 15 seconds. It looks like a compliance buffer, designed to look like standard transaction processing. It's not. It's a deliberate obfuscation layer, and the specific structure of it, the account sequencing and the timing offset. I've seen this before. In a different network, in a different region. Rao went still. You're saying the same person designed both, or the same methodology was shared. Either way, there's a connection. She pulled up a second window. I need you to run these account numbers against the database for the Terracon network, the partial dismantlement from 14 months ago. Rao sat down at the second terminal and started running. Evelyn kept working through Nasir's ledger, building the map in her head, the branches of the network becoming clearer as the hours accumulated. At hour 5, she had a structure. Not complete. There were gaps, accounts she couldn't trace, transfer records that had been deliberately fragmented. But enough. 6 of the 7 cells located within the financial architecture with sufficient precision to generate targeting coordinates. The 7th was a gap in the structure that told her it existed without telling her where. She also had the connection to the Terracon network. 3 accounts. A transfer pattern that repeated on a 19-day cycle, consistent between both networks, consistent enough to be a signature rather than a coincidence, which meant the person behind the Terracon network, the partially dismantled one, The one that had survived the operation 14 months ago was not only still active, but had extended their infrastructure into Nasir's operation. She had known this was possible. She had thought it was probable. She had not known, until this moment, that she could prove it. She leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and let the full weight of what she was looking at settle. 3 years of work. Her work and the work of people she had operated alongside, whose names she could not say in any room without a specific authorization code. The Terracon operation that had closed 2 of 3 nodes and lost the third. The third node that had become this. And now, inside this, the thread that led back through it all. Rao came and stood beside her and looked at the screen. "Is that what I think it is?" Rao said. "Yes." "The Terracon connection is real." "Yes." Rao was quiet for a moment. "This is going to require a separate report." "I know." "A classified addendum, above the level of this debrief package." "I know. I'll write it." Rao looked at her. "How long have you been looking for this?" "Long enough." "How long is that?" She looked at the screen, at the 3 account numbers and the 19-day transfer cycle, and the thread that connected them to a network she had spent 3 years pursuing across 2 regions and 2 programs. 26 months, she said. Give or take. Rao absorbed this, said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'll get Morrison." "Wait." Evelyn looked at her. "Not yet. I need another hour. The 6th cell location is in the ledger. I can see its outline. I need to build the full coordinates before I bring Morrison in, because once I do, the operational clock starts and I won't have time to finish the analysis." Rao looked at the screen, looked at her, made a professional judgment. 1 hour, she said. "Then I get him regardless." 1 hour. Rao left. Evelyn turned back to the screen. The 6th cell was in the ledger, buried in a sequence of transactions that were designed to look like supply chain payments. She had almost missed it at hour 3. Now, working backward, from what she knew about the account structure, she could see it clearly. The payment timing, the geographic signature in the account routing codes, the amount calibration that matched the operational expenditure pattern of a mobile element, Eastern Highland District. 3 locations on a rotation cycle, transit pattern identical to Nasser's cell before they'd taken him. She had it at the 50-minute mark. She stood up, stretched the knee, and went to get Morrison. I was in the common building with Webb, both of them with coffee and the slightly depleted look of men who had been running on operational momentum for 3 days and were beginning to feel the debt accumulate. "Operations room," she said. "Both of you." Webb looked at her. Something in his face asked the question before he could. "Now," she said. They came. Rao had the screens ready. Evelyn walked them through it. The full network map, the 6 cell locations, the connection to the Terracon network. She was precise and unhurried, and she gave them enough context to understand the significance without giving them more than they needed to act on it. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Morrison looked at the screen, at the 6 locations, at the Terracon connection. 26 months, he said. "Yes." "You've been running this for 26 months. My program has been running it. I've been the primary asset in the field for the last 14. He worked his jaw, looked at the screen again. "The 7th cell. Still a gap. The account structure tells me it exists. It doesn't tell me where. Can you find it? Given more time with the materials, possibly. Given access to the Terracon database files that aren't currently on this network, more likely. I'll get you that access." He looked at Rao. "Flag it priority and get it through channels." "It'll take 12 hours minimum," Rao said. "Then start now." Webb had been quiet through all of this. He was standing at the wall, the same posture he always used, and he was looking at the network map on the screen with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not closed and professional, something else, working through something. "Webb," Morrison said. "The first brief," Webb said. He was still looking at the screen. When she corrected the choke point geometry, he paused. "I thought it was showing off. I thought—" He stopped, looked at her. "You already had the full operational picture in your head. You were already working the second objective." "I was working both objectives simultaneously," she said. "Yes. And I spent the first night treating you like—" He stopped again. "Like someone whose presence you hadn't authorized and whose competence you hadn't verified," she said. which was your correct professional response to the information you had. My response was based on things that had nothing to do with your competence, he said. It was the same thing he'd said on the tarmac after the first operation, but stripped now of the context that had surrounded it then. Cleaner, more direct. She looked at him. Say it plainly, Commander. He met her eyes. I looked at you and I made assumptions. Before you spoke, before you showed me anything, I made assumptions based on who you looked like you were. A pause. That's not professional skepticism. That's something else. The room was quiet. Bias is not an assessment, she said. No, he said, it's not. Morrison was watching this exchange with the careful attention of a man who understood exactly what was happening and had decided it needed to happen without his intervention. Webb looked at the screen again. 6 cells, 14 months of work. He looked back at her. And none of it is going to have your name on it. No. Does that... He stopped. Does it bother me? He waited. The record doesn't need my name, she said. It needs to be accurate. She looked at the screen, at the 6 locations, and the thread back to Terracon and the 26 months of work that had produced this map. An accurate record is the whole point. Morrison set his coffee down. We have 6 targets and a 7-hour planning window before the first of those cell locations falls outside the viable strike window based on the rotation cycle. He looked at Rao. Get higher on the line. We're going to need additional elements and authorization for simultaneous targeting. He looked at Evelyn. You're in this planning session. I know. Not as an observer. She almost smiled at that. Almost. No, she said. Not as an observer. He nodded. Turned to the screens and began to work. Webb remained at the wall for a moment. He was looking at her, not the way he had looked at her in the first briefing room, not the managed professional neutrality of the tarmac after the first operation, something that had moved past both of those into something simpler and harder to perform. He pushed off the wall and came to the table, sat down, pulled the network map toward him and started looking at it the way he looked at things he was going to act on. Evelyn watched him for a moment. Then she pulled her chair to the table and sat beside him and looked at the map. Outside the operations building, the mountain sun had reached its apex and was beginning the long descent toward the western ridgeline. The generators hummed. The antenna arrays pulled signals from the sky. In the intelligence cell next door, Rao was on a secure line to hire, requesting access and authorization and the additional assets that 6 simultaneous targets would require. The 7th cell was still out there. Still a gap in the map. She would find it. She knew the methodology, knew the signature, and with the Terracon database access that Morrison was now pushing through channels, she would find the thread. But that was the next problem. This problem. The 6 locations, the operational window, the planning session that was already beginning around her set. This was the immediate one. She looked at the map. She looked at the thread back to Terracon, at the 26 months of work made visible at last in a room full of people who now understood, at least partially, what it had cost. She picked up her pen and began to work. The planning session ran 9 hours, not because the targets were complicated. 6 simultaneous strikes against fixed locations with confirmed personnel was, in the operational vocabulary of the people in that room, a manageable problem. It ran 9 hours because the authorization chain required coordination across 3 commands, 2 agencies, and a joint task force that had not previously been read into the Terracon connection, and because each of those entities had questions that needed answers, and people who needed to understand the full picture before they would sign the orders that made the strikes possible. Evelyn answered most of the questions. Not because Morrison deferred to her, he ran the planning session with the same focused command he brought to everything, but because the questions that came back through the authorization chain were intelligence questions, network architecture questions, questions about the Terracon connection and what it meant for the broader operational picture, and those questions had one person in the room who could answer them with authority. She answered them plainly, without hedging, without the diplomatic softening that institutional communications sometimes required. At one point, a senior officer on the secure video link from the Joint Task Force pushed back on her timeline estimate for the 7th cell's next location transition. Your projection is based on a 19-day cycle, he said. Nasser's cell ran a 4 to 6 day cycle. Why would the 7th cell be different? Because the seventh cell handles different functions, she said. Nasser managed financial logistics. Frequent movement made sense. The seventh cell, based on the account structure gaps in the ledger, appears to handle personnel and materiel. Longer cycle, more complex coordination requirements. She paused. The 19-day figure is a floor estimate, not a ceiling. They could be faster. They won't be slower. A pause on the other end. You're confident. I'm accurate, she said. Those aren't the same thing. Morrison, beside her, said nothing. But she noticed he didn't correct her, and the officer on the link moved on. By 0200, the authorization was complete. 6 strike packages, simultaneous execution at 0400, coordinated with additional elements that had been moved into position over the previous 6 hours. Evelyn's role in the strikes themselves was finished. She had given the intelligence, built the map, and the kinetic execution was in the hands of people whose job it was to execute. She sat at the edge of the operations room while the final coordination ran and drank her 4th cup of terrible coffee and felt the specific dry exhaustion of someone who had been running at cognitive maximum for 72 hours and was now in the decompression phase whether she wanted to be or not. Coletti appeared beside her. He dropped into the chair next to her without asking, which she had come to understand was his version of courtesy. He'd decided she didn't need the formality, and he was right. You look terrible, he said. I know. When did you last sleep more than 4 hours? She thought about it. Before the assignment, he made a sound that was not quite a laugh. The 7th cell, he said. You're still working it. In my head, yes. Even now. It doesn't turn off. He was quiet for a moment, his hands around his own mug. Is that a skill thing or a... He stopped, reconsidered the question. Does it bother you that it doesn't turn off? She looked at the screens. The 6 target packages, each one a location on the network map she had built from 26 months of work and 7 hours with Nasir's ledger. Sometimes, she said, that's the most honest thing you've said since I met you. I've been completely honest. You've been accurate. That's not the same thing. He looked at her sideways. Sometimes is honest. Sometimes is a person. She didn't respond to that, but she didn't look away from it either, which was a different thing. At 0357, Morrison called the room to attention. Not formally, just his voice cutting through the ambient noise, pulling focus. 3 minutes to execution window. All elements confirmed in position. Rao? Confirmed, Rao said. All 6 packages. ISR is up on all targets. Command net is active. We're monitoring. The room went quiet. The particular quality of quiet that happened in an operations center when the action had moved beyond the room and the people in it had done everything they could do and were now in the position of watching and recording. 400. The net came alive. 6 simultaneous reports, staggered by seconds, each one a compressed burst of professional language that said the same thing in 6 different ways. The element was on target. The objective was met. The package was secured or the location was cleared. She listened and built the picture and cross-referenced it against the network map in her head, confirming each location against the financial architecture she had spent 7 hours reconstructing. 5 of 6 went exactly as planned. The 6th, a location in the northern part of the Eastern District, reported an empty building. Cleared, no personnel, no materials. The cell had moved. She had known this was a possibility. The rotation cycle was an estimate, and estimates had variance. She had said so in the planning session. It didn't make the empty building less significant. Morrison looked at her from across the room. The 7th, she said. They moved because the 7th cell warned them. They're in communication. They have to be. The financial architecture requires it. The 7th cell handles material coordination, which means they're in regular contact with the field elements. She looked at the network map. The 6th cell's location is now wherever the 7th cell tells them to go, which means finding the 7th cell finds the 6th. Yes. He looked at the room, looked at Rao. Get the Terracon database access I requested. Where are we on that? It came through 40 minutes ago, Rao said. I was waiting for the execution window to close before I flagged it. Evelyn was already moving toward the terminal. Halt. She found the 7th cell at 0847. Not through the Terracon database alone, through the intersection of 3 datasets. the Terracon account records, the timing signatures in Nasir's ledger, and a communications intercept that Echo at the signal station had pulled during the night operations and flagged as low priority because it was encrypted and the source location was inconsistent with the known network footprint. The inconsistency was the point. The seventh cell operated outside the expected geographic footprint precisely because its function required it to. And the encryption pattern, she recognized it from the Terracon operation, a variant of the same methodology, the same digital fingerprint in the structure of the encrypted traffic, even when the content was unreadable. She brought Rao in. Rao confirmed the signals match in 20 minutes, then they brought Morrison. He looked at the location on the map for a moment. Western District, he said, outside our current operational area. Yes, that's going to require a separate authorization package. I know. Different command authority. Different element. I know that too. She looked at the map. But the location is confirmed and the cell is active. The window is approximately 9 days before the next rotation. That's enough time to build the package. Morrison studied the map. You won't be here for it. No. He looked at her. Your assignment to this element ends when? It ended when Nasir was taken, she said. Everything since has been the secondary objective. That's complete now. She paused. My next assignment is already waiting. The room absorbed this. Rao looked at the screen. Morrison looked at the map. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The seventh cell package, Morrison said. I'll forward it with a full recommendation for priority authorization. Your analysis will be attached. Make sure the Terracon connection is documented in the attachment. The command authority for the Western District needs to understand the full picture, or they'll treat it as a standalone target and miss the broader significance. Understood. He paused. I'll make sure the record reflects your work on this, both the field operations and the intelligence analysis. The record needs to be accurate, she said. That's all. He looked at her for a moment. That's all, he repeated. He said it in a way that acknowledged the weight behind those 3 words, the specific weight of someone who had spent years doing work that almost never appeared in any record with sufficient accuracy to matter. Yes, she said. She spent the next 4 hours writing the classified addendum. The Terracon connection, documented fully, cross-referenced against every relevant data point from both the field operations and the ledger analysis. The 7th cell location with the full evidentiary basis for the identification. The 6th cell's current unknown location and the analytical path for finding it through the 7th. It was the most complete piece of work she had produced in a single sitting in 3 years. Not because the individual components were complicated, she had built each of them incrementally over months of work, but because this was the first time all of them existed in the same document, connected, legible, a complete picture rather than fragments distributed across 4 security architectures. She read it through once when she finished, found 2 imprecisions in the language and corrected them, found nothing else that needed changing. She flagged it for classification review and submitted it. Then she sat at the empty terminal for a moment and looked at her hands. They were still steady. They were always steady. She thought about that, about what it meant and what it cost, and whether the cost was one she had made a genuine choice about, or simply a cost that the work had extracted over time without her fully accounting for it. She didn't arrive at a clean answer, which was consistent with the 9 years of evidence available to her on the question. A knock on the intelligence cell door frame. Webb. He stood in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, the better variety, which meant he had made a specific effort, which meant something. He held one out. She took it. He came in and sat across from her at the terminal. He looked at the screen, now showing the submitted documents classification header. He didn't ask what it was. You're leaving, he said. Today. He nodded, looked at his coffee. I've been thinking about the first brief, he said. What I said to Morrison after. When you corrected the choke point geometry and I went to him and said, he stopped. She waited. I told him you were probably an analyst who'd spent too much time behind a desk and not enough in the field, and that the Overwatch slot should go to Kessler. He said it flatly, the way you said things when you had decided that the only way to deal with them was to say them exactly as they were. He told me the assignment was confirmed and to prepare my element. A pause. He was right. Yes. I wasn't wrong to question it, he said. But what I questioned wasn't your competence. I didn't have any information about your competence. I questioned, he stopped again, started again. I questioned whether someone who looked the way you look should be in that slot. And I dressed that up as operational caution, and I knew, even when I was doing it, that it wasn't entirely that. The room was quiet. The generators hummed through the wall. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because you deserve to hear it said plainly. He met her eyes. Not dressed up as something else. She looked at him. He was a man who had been excellent at his job for a long time and had built his professional identity around that excellence and had just found a place where that identity had failed him. Not in the field, not in the execution, but in the prior judgment that had led to the execution. That was a harder thing to sit with than a tactical failure. Tactical failures had corrective procedures. This kind of failure required a different process. You changed, she said. I'm trying to. That's different from having changed. I know. He looked at his coffee. I know that. She thought about what to say. Not the comfortable thing. She had never been particularly good at the comfortable thing, and this conversation didn't seem to want it anyway. The men who don't try to change, she said, are the ones who cost people their lives later. Not because they're bad operators, because they don't put the right people in the right positions when it matters. She paused. You trying is the whole point. He was quiet for a moment. Then, does it get easier? Operating in environments where people start where I started, with you. No, she said. You just get better at not letting it affect your performance. That's a depressing answer. It's the true one. He made a small sound. Not quite a laugh. Not far from one. He stood, picked up his coffee, and looked at her across the terminal. For what it's worth, he said, the element, all of us. We know what happened out there. Both nights. The roof guard, the road, the northern cluster. He paused. We know what you did. We're not going to forget it. You don't need to remember it on my behalf, she said. Remember it on yours. Let it change how you run your element. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, clean, the kind of nod that meant he had received something and intended to keep it. He walked out. She was packed and ready at 1400. The logistics helicopter back to the main base was scheduled for 14:30, and from there a flight that would get her to her next assignment by the following morning. She didn't know the details of the next assignment yet. The brief was waiting in a secure folder she wouldn't access until she was on the aircraft. But she knew the general shape of it because the general shape of her work had been consistent for 9 years. A new location, new terrain, a new set of people who would look at her and make their first assessment and be wrong about it in the specific way that people were reliably wrong about her, and she would do what she always did, which was absorb the assessment and wait and let the work speak in the language that the work always spoke. She carried her pack and her rifle to the staging area. The station was active around her. The operational tempo following the night strikes was high, the intelligence product flowing back through channels, RAW coordinating with the analytical teams at higher, the element members moving between equipment areas, and the operations building with the focused energy of people who had closed 6 targets in a single night and were already thinking about the next problem. Morrison was at the helicopter pad when she arrived. He was alone, which surprised her slightly. She had expected the logistics of departure to be handled by someone more administrative. He stood with his arms at his sides and looked at her as she approached. The mountain behind him was enormous in the afternoon light, the limestone face catching the sun at an angle that made it look almost warm. 7 cells, he said. You came here for 7 cells. 6 confirmed, 1 located. 7, he said again. The way he said it was not an argument. It was a statement of the full account. She set her pack down on the edge of the pad. The helicopter wasn't here yet. She could hear it in the distance, inbound from the main base. The addendum, she said. Make sure it goes to the right people. The Western District Command needs the full Terracon context, or they'll underweight the priority. I'll personally deliver the recommendation. And the 6th cell's current location. When the 7th cell package runs, make sure whoever executes it understands that the 6th cell is mobile and in communication. They'll need to move fast after the strike. It'll be in the brief. She nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. When you wrote the addendum, the Terracon connection, the full picture, when you submitted it, did it? He searched for the right word. Did it feel like something resolved? She thought about it honestly. It felt like the record got more accurate, she said, which is what I needed it to be. That's not quite an answer. It's the accurate one. He almost smiled at that. You know, in 12 years of running operations, I've worked with a lot of people who are exceptional at specific things. Pilots, breakers, communicators, shooters, people who were the best in a narrow lane. He looked at her. I've never worked with someone who is doing 3 different jobs simultaneously and doing all of them better than the person I'd have assigned to each one. She didn't respond. That's not flattery, he said. That's an operational assessment. I know the difference, she said. Thank you. The helicopter appeared over the southern ridgeline, dropping into the valley approach, the sound of it filling the space between the mountains. Morrison picked up her pack before she could reach for it and held it out to her. Not as a gesture of service, just the natural motion of a person helping another person with something that needed to be done. She took it. One question, he said. Before you go. She waited. The program. Program 7, or whatever it actually is. The 11 years. He paused. Was it your choice? She thought about that. It was a better question than most people would have thought to ask. The first assignment was a choice, she said. The second was a choice. After that, she looked at the mountains. After that, choice is the wrong frame. It becomes who you are. You don't choose it any more than you choose your own nature. He absorbed this. The helicopter was close now, the rotor wash beginning to reach them, the noise making conversation increasingly effortful. He held out his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and direct and lasted exactly as long as it needed to. She turned and walked toward the helicopter. She was airborne for 20 minutes before the weight of the previous 72 hours fully arrived. Not emotion exactly. She had been precise about that distinction for a long time, the difference between emotion and the physiological aftermath of sustained operational stress, though she acknowledged privately that the line between them was not always as clear as she had once believed. What arrived was a heaviness, a settling. The specific sensation of a person who has been held at tension for a long time and has finally been released from it. She looked out the open door at the mountains falling away below. 6 cells. 26 months. The thread back to Tarragon, documented and submitted, and now in the hands of people who would act on it. The 7th cell identified, located, the package built. The contractors alive. Nasser in custody. 30 people who had come home because she had been in the right position at the right moment and had made the right calculations. None of it would have her name on it. The addendum carried her identifier code, a string of numbers and letters that would be meaningful to approximately 40 people, but not her name. Her name lived in a security architecture that most of the people she had worked alongside over 9 years would never access. She had made peace with that, or she had built something that functioned well enough like peace to be usable. What she had not expected, what she was still processing, in the honest part of her that existed behind the operational discipline, was the tarmac, the salute. Morrison and Webb and Briggs and Coletti and all the others raising their hands in the dark before dawn. Nobody had done that. In 9 years. In 7 countries. In programs that officially didn't exist and operations that officially hadn't happened. She had told herself over those 9 years that acknowledgement wasn't the point, that the work was the point, that the record being accurate was the only form of recognition that mattered, and it mattered only instrumentally, so that the work could continue to be assigned to her, so that she could keep doing what she was built to do. She believed that. She still believed it. But she also understood, with the clarity that the 72 hours had produced and that the altitude and the exhaustion were no longer allowing her to contain, that she had needed to be seen, not celebrated, not decorated, just seen, clearly, accurately, by people who had the standing to understand what they were looking at. And for 3 days at a forward station in the mountains, she had been. She looked at her hands, steady. They were always steady, but her jaw was tight, and her eyes, she was aware of her eyes in the way you became aware of things you were working to keep controlled, were doing something she hadn't allowed them to do in a professional context in a very long time. She let them. The mountains below were enormous and indifferent, and the sky above them was the blue of altitude, clean and deep. And the helicopter carried her south at 140 knots, and the wind came through the open door and she let it. She didn't cry in any dramatic way, just the quiet, private kind. A few seconds, maybe 10, of being a person rather than a function, of letting the weight of 9 years press through the composure long enough to acknowledge that the weight existed. Then she straightened, wiped her face with the back of her hand, looked back at the mountains. Done. Ate. 3 weeks later, in a city she couldn't name and a building that didn't officially exist, a man named Gerald Forsyth called her into an office she had been in twice before and told her that her consolidated record, the full account of 9 years of classified operations across 4 programs, had finally been assembled into a single secure file. He was 63, white-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent 4 decades in work that required him to know things about people that those people didn't know he knew. He had been her handler for the last 6 years in the functional sense of the word, the person on the institutional side who managed her assignments, her access, and the fragments of her record. He was not warm, exactly, but he was consistent and accurate, and she had learned that in her world those qualities were worth more than warmth. He sat across from her with the file on the desk between them, physically, a slim folder, which was almost funny given what it represented, and said, "Everything is in there, Tarragon, the Black Ridge operation, the full account." She looked at the folder. "The 7th cell," he said. "The Western District package ran 6 days ago. The cell was taken. The 6th cell's current location was identified through the 7th cell's communications and is now under active surveillance." He paused. "The Terracon network connection is being used to restructure the broader intelligence architecture for the entire region. Your analysis changed how they're mapping the whole thing." She had known some of this, not all of it. "Morrison submitted a formal commendation," Forsyth said, "above the classification level of his own record. It's in there." "That wasn't necessary." "He thought it was." A pause. "Several of the element members contributed written accounts. Webb's is," Forsyth paused, "it's direct. More honest than most people would be about their own initial response." She looked at the folder. "The record is complete," Forsyth said. "Everything you've done, attributed correctly, documented fully. It will never be public, but it exists." He paused. "The right people have seen it." The office was quiet. Outside, the city made its ordinary sounds: traffic, wind, the distant noise of a building under construction. "I know what this work costs," Forsyth said. He said it carefully, the way you said something that you meant fully and didn't want to have dismissed. "I've been in this building a long time, and I know what the classified world extracts from the people who operate in it. The isolation, the constraint, He paused. "The invisibility." He looked at her. "I want you to know that what you did, not just Black Ridge, the full account, it mattered. It mattered at a scale that I can see from where I sit, and that you probably can't see from where you are." She looked at the folder for a moment, then at him. "Someone knew what you had done," he said. It was as close as Forsyth came to the personal. Coming from him, it was considerable. She felt something shift in her chest. Not the tarmac feeling. That had been sudden, unexpected, the shock of being seen by people she had not known would see her. This was different, quieter, more like the resolution of a sustained note. "Thank you," she said. She meant it. He nodded once, pushed the folder across the desk. "Your next assignment brief is in there as well. New theater, different terrain. You'll want to read it tonight." She picked up the folder, stood. Forsyth looked at her from across the desk. Not with sentiment, not with the managed distance of pure professionalism, but with something in between that she recognized because she had seen it before in the rare instances when people who had been in this world a very long time looked at people who were still in it and understood what that meant. "Take a week," he said, "before you read the brief. You've earned it." She thought about it. 2 days. 3. She almost smiled. 3. She walked out of the office and down the corridor and through the building's unremarkable lobby and out onto the street, where the city was doing its ordinary things around her. People moving in the way people moved in cities when they had ordinary lives and ordinary purposes, and no particular awareness of the unremarkable building they were walking past, or the woman who had just walked out of it with a slim classified folder under her arm. She stood on the pavement for a moment, tilted her face toward the sun, which was weak and pale at this latitude but present. 3 days. She hadn't had 3 consecutive unscheduled days in 11 months. She wasn't entirely sure what she would do with them. Sleep, probably. Walk. Sit in a place where the light was different from mountain light and not do any calculations at all. Her hands were in her jacket pockets. She could feel them, the steadiness of them, the particular stillness that 9 years had built into her without her asking for it. She thought about Coletti saying sometimes is a person, about Webb sitting down at the map table and starting to work, about Morrison on the tarmac in the dark, raising his hand, about the record, finally complete, finally accurate, the full account of 9 years attributed correctly and documented fully and filed in a system where the right people could access it. She thought about the next brief, waiting in the folder. A new theater, different terrain, different mountains probably, because it was always mountains, and different people who would look at her arrival and make their first assessment and be wrong about it in the particular way people were wrong about her. That was fine. She knew what to do with that. She turned and walked down the street into the ordinary noise of a city that had no idea who had just walked through it, and for 3 days she was simply a person in the world rather than a function within it. That was enough. It was, she thought, exactly enough. The world doesn't always recognize what it owes to the people who operate in its shadows, but that doesn't diminish what they carry or what they choose to carry it for. True capability doesn't require